Chapter 372, Missing Case. After waiting for more than half an hour and confirming that nothing unexpected had happened, Klein and Emlyn White left Lawyer Jurgen's house and proceeded in silence, each of them preoccupied with their own thoughts. Soon, they arrived outside 15 Minsk Street. The vampire, Emlyn White, put his fist to his mouth, coughed lightly, and said, "The payment has been paid. I hope we won't meet again in the future." "That sounds pretty cool, but Mr. White, have you forgotten something important?" Klein smiled politely. "I will visit Bishop Yatravsky every now and then, and I hope you will not be at the Harvest Church when the time comes. That way, I don't have to busy myself with finding a way to solve the inducing suggestion planted in your psyche." Emlyn White's expression suddenly became very strange. He stayed silent for 2 seconds before he raised his chin and said, "We have many powerful mysticologists among the sanguine. I will write to them for help." After he finished speaking, he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed to bid farewell. Turning around and taking a few steps, he suddenly slowed down, turned his head, and asked hesitantly, "What were you cooking over here?" "Beef bone radish soup, with rice and chili peppers from the Fainapotter Highlands," Klein said in anticipation as he breathed in the fragrance drifting out from the house. Emlyn frowned and shook his head. "Chili peppers aren't things fancied by the sanguine. Frankly speaking, it's hard for me to imagine a vampire eating chili peppers. Of course, I occasionally imagine a vampire holding a steamed bun and chewing on garlic and onions." Klein silently lampooned, pointed to the door, and indicated that he was about to enjoy his dinner. Emlyn White thought for a second, lowered his voice, and said in deliberation, "Last night, I thought over things for a long time and found out that you actually didn't do anything, so why are you asking for compensation? That old man would have let me leave at any moment." Klein chuckled. "No, that's not how the accounts are done. Your parents assigned a mission to find you, not to save you. In the end, I found you. According to the agreement, the reward should belong to me. Besides, if I hadn't reminded you, you might have stayed in Harvest Church for weeks or months before you realized that you were free to leave. Furthermore, you wouldn't have noticed the seed planted in your mind. Are you hinting that my intelligence isn't up to par?" Emlyn's face twisted. "No, I'm saying it directly." Klein smiled but didn't say anything else. He just opened the door and went straight to the kitchen, his mind full of the clear and alluring soup, the white rice, the soft yet chewy beef, the marrow hidden deep in the bones, the sweet, refreshing radishes with meaty flavors, and the shredded chili from the Fainapotter Highlands. In the spicy hot shreds, there were also pink rose salt and green parsley leaves. On Thursday morning, as promised, Klein went to the value-for-money coffee shop in East Borough. Old Kohler, who was still wearing the same thick jacket as before, was sitting in a corner, matching tea that barely tasted like tea with a loaf of black bread. Klein came in front of him, took out the things he had prepared long ago, and pushed them towards him. It was payment consisting of 2 5-soldi notes, for 1 soldi notes, and a handful of copper pennies specially designed to increase the effect of the payment. Old Kohler stared straight at them for quite a while before finally reaching out his right hand to take them with a tremble. He looked at the money over and over again, raised his hand to wipe his eyes, and squeezed out a smile. "At the dock, we carry the heavy goods and do some troublesome cleaning with our feet in the cold and dirty water, only for 1 soldi a day, and there was a total of 15 soldi here." Klein listened in silence. A few seconds later, he said, "What have you heard recently? What did you notice?" Old Kohler put away his payment, took another sip of his tea, pinched the corners of his eyes and said, "I've met a lot of dockworkers, and I've reconnected with friends I used to know when I was a tramp. Some of them have found employment in factories, and some of them have been switching between the workhouse and the parks. Just like how I was in the past. Recently, there has been a rumor from who knows where that since we believe in one of the 7 gods, why don't we directly pray to the creator of everything? It's said that he didn't truly pass away, and he remains in everyone's body and in all things. Praying to him will result in our redemption. Not only will we enter his kingdom after death, but we will also have a better life before death. For example, we don't need to work so hard, and we can have butter and oily meat every day. Is this some theory the Aurora Order has spread about the fallen creator? After what happened to Lenivis, they've begun to pay attention to the poor in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district, hoping to use them for certain purposes? I wonder if the three churches have noticed this. They probably have. Klein tucked a piece of butter between two slices of toast and took a bite without knowing what to expect. Old Kohler went on for a while before saying, "Mr. Detective, according to your instructions, I paid attention to the female textile workers. In the end, with the help of the police, their struggles failed, but, the leaders became the factory's supervisors, and a third of them lost their jobs. Some of them are actively looking for new jobs, some have become street girls, and some have gone off somewhere. The entire East Borough is in chaos." If this was the situation when Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos came to Backlund, he could come to East Borough to kill 1 or 2 people every day without anyone discovering or noticing the act. Klein sighed in his heart. Old Kohler continued to recount what he saw and heard daily before saying, "By the way, Liv's youngest daughter has gone missing." Liv? Klein was certain that he had never heard of the name. Old Kohler then said in realization, "She's the laundry maid you and Mr. Reporter met last time, the one who was arguing with someone. She was always at home doing the washing with her 2 daughters, but yesterday, when her 2 daughters were returning home from delivering the laundry, one of them ended up missing. The younger one, what a pity. She's been a widow for years, and she has always been counting on her 2 daughters, and now. Sigh, the police in East Borough definitely won't look too hard for her. Unlucky people tend to meet with even worse situations because they have no ability to resist danger or change their environment." This phrase suddenly flashed through Klein's mind. After a few seconds of stone-like silence, he said, "Take me to see them. I'm a detective, so maybe I can help them find her." "They have no money," Old Kohler reminded him. Klein picked up his hat and cane and said, "I occasionally do volunteer work too. Sherwood Borough, in the apartment which the 2 ladies originally rented." Zio had resumed her life as a bounty hunter, and Furs hastened the pace of her new book, hoping to save the money needed for the Beyonder ingredients required by the Trickmaster potion. But writing a book wasn't something one could write that easily. Furs scratched her hair irritably and decided to go out for a walk to seek out inspiration. As she walked, she found that she had unknowingly returned to a familiar place. Diagonally ahead of her was the Yosefov Clinic, a fairly large private clinic where she had first worked. After staring at it for a while, Furs thought of the old lady who had guided her into the Beyonder world. She turned into a small alley on the right and took a shortcut to a nearby street. The 2 sides of the street had leaves fluttering down the parasol tree. It was a relatively quiet place. Furs remembered that the old lady lived at Unit 39. Back then, she would occasionally visit personally to deliver medicine, give injections, or even to help with the daily chores. It's almost been 3 years. That place should have been rented out again. There might have been several changes in tenants. I still remember when I came to tidy up the items she left behind. I discovered many notebooks about mysticism. Furs walked under the nearly barren parasol tree and slowly approached Unit 39. As she recalled her past experiences, she gradually gained some inspiration for writing. At that moment, she saw an old man in a heavy woolen coat and a black half-top hat standing in front of Unit 39. He had rung the bell 3 times. After a few minutes, seeing that no one was opening the door, the old man with blue eyes shook his head and turned around. He whispered in puzzlement, "Still no one." He suddenly noticed Furs who was looking at him from nearby. He hurriedly walked over, gently and urgently smiled, and said, "Beautiful lady, do you live in this district? Do you know Labero and Elisa?" "Elisa?" Isn't that the old lady's name? There haven't been any tenants in this house lately? After some deliberation, Furs said, I don't know if the Mrs. Elisa I know is the one you're looking for. She lived here for a long time, but she passed away 3 years ago. Passed away 3 years ago? What about Libero? The old man with wrinkles at the corners of his eyes hurriedly asked. Her husband passed away even earlier than she did, Furs answered honestly. The elder was momentarily stunned before revealing a sorrowful expression. After a moment of silence, he said, Thank you, good lady. I am the elder brother of Libero, and I've been living in Mid-Seashire all this time. As I haven't received any letters from them for a long time, I decided to come and pay them a visit. Can you tell me what happened to them in the past few years? Mrs. Elisa's husband's elder brother. Could he be a descendant of the family she spoke of? Furs suddenly snapped to her senses and replied with a smile, no problem. She quickly thought through what she could and couldn't say. The elder pointed behind him and said, There's quite a nice coffee shop over there. Klein once again stepped into the humid room of a slightly old apartment in East Borough. He saw the woman who had quarreled with the street girl last time over her contempt towards her profession. She was standing in a pile of clothes. Her wrinkled face had lost a lot of its spirit, she lost her laborious drive, and she looked lifeless. As for her eldest daughter, the 17 to 18-year-old girl who was sitting by the bed and washing clothes, she kept sobbing. It's all my fault. I didn't watch over her properly. I shouldn't have taken her into the secluded alley. She even said that she was going to learn a few more words at the free school tonight. It's my fault, it's all my fault. Liv suddenly regained her senses and turned to look at her eldest daughter. She wiped away her sad expression and berated her fiercely, What are you crying for? Get up and wash the clothes. Do you want to starve? Do you plan on not even being able to attend the free school? After screaming, she saw Klein and Old Kohler at the door. Old Kohler. This is, she asked doubtfully. Chapter 373, Search. Old Kohler seemed to be slightly afraid of her ferocity as he subconsciously took a step back. Liv, this is a detective, and he wishes to help you find Daisy. Liv's wrinkled, peeling face turned to Klein and said coldly, We've already made a police report. Although she was perhaps in her 30s, she looked to be in her 50s. Klein looked around the room where many wet clothes hung. He vaguely remembered the last time he was here. There had been a 13 or 14-year-old girl, carefully holding a crude homemade iron to iron the clothes which had wrinkled from being hung to dry. Her hands had been covered with burns. She's the missing Daisy. Klein looked back at the laundry maid, Liv, and said in a neutral tone, Do you believe that the East Borough Police will really be looking for Daisy? Are you sure the people who caused Daisy to go missing wouldn't cast their sights on your family? Do you wish to lose another daughter after losing one? When the cruel yet heart-wrenching words reached Liv's ears, the indifferent expression on her face slowly crumbled. She turned agape, but she couldn't say anything. The corners of her eyes gradually turned red. She abruptly lowered her head and muttered to herself in pain and despair, I don't have any money. The room suddenly became silent. Even the sobbing girl didn't make another sound. Klein pursed his lips and let out a silent sigh. I occasionally do volunteer work, simply to help others. Heh, I haven't done so in a long time, so please give me a chance. Volunteer work? Liv lifted her head and ruminated over the phrase. Klein nodded slightly and answered, The job will be done pro bono. No, it is not completely free either. Kindness will bring me great satisfaction. Since you have no other solutions, why not give it a try? Liv was silent for a moment. She raised her hand, which had wrinkled from being soaked in water for an extended period of time, wiped her eyes, and said in a low voice, Mr. Detective, you really are a kind and good gentleman. Her voice suddenly became choked with sobs. This was what happened. at midday before yesterday, at noon, Daisy delivered a load of washed laundry under Freja's lead. It was just outside East Borough, and they needed to cross several streets. In order to rush back for lunch, Freja had chosen a secluded alley, but a momentary distraction left her realizing that Daisy, who had been following her, was gone. She retraced her route but never found Daisy, and Daisy hasn't come back yet. Where did this happen, Freja? The girl named Freja had already stood up, her eyes were red and puffy. She sobbed and said, right here in Broken Axe Lane, Mr. Detective. Will Daisy be all right? Probably, Klein replied without much of an expression. He looked around and asked, do you have anything that Daisy often carries? I can borrow a police dog. It has an excellent sense of smell and can be used to find a person based on the lingering scent. No, Liv thought for a moment and said with a sad expression. Freja once again shed tears. She felt as if the situation had turned into one of despair once again. Suddenly, she blinked and said, wait, there's something. Daisy's vocabulary book. Vocabulary book? Old Kohler asked. Liv sniffed and said, I make Freja and Daisy attend the free school at night. I can keep washing clothes, but they can't always be doing the same. This lady is such a good mother. Klein couldn't help but sigh. The free classes offered at night were set up by the 3 major churches or some charity organizations. From 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening, the school would be free of charge and would even provide stationery and a certain amount of paper. It was an education that was need-blind, and it would at most involve some religious knowledge. Klein had heard old Neil mention that he had once been a teacher for the Church of the Evernight Goddess for several years. Because there were very few people who volunteered to be teachers in the free school, a unique teaching method was established. Teachers would arrive early, gather the few students who had the best academic progress, imbue them with the content for that day's class, and then put them in charge of teaching the different classes. The teachers would supervise, correcting any mistakes. It was called a tutorial system. Corresponding to the free classes were the free organizations such as the Technical Workers' Workshop, which were truly accessible to the poor, and one of the few outlets to escape from poverty. Unfortunately, there were too few similar organizations, and it was difficult for them to play a substantial role. At this moment, the sobbing Freja added, Daisy liked studying very much. She was made the tutor of her class by her teacher. She would put together the vocabulary words she had copied and hug them in her bed every day. She would wake up early and go out into the street to recite them under the light of dawn. She's always found it regretful that there are no street lamps around here. As she spoke, Freja rushed back to the bunk bed and took out a stack of crumpled paper from under the tattered pillow. Due to it being in a humid environment for extended periods of time, the words that were copied on it had already smudged. The edges of the sheets of paper were worn out, as though they had been turned over and over by someone for a long time. Mr. Detective, is this okay? Freja handed Klein the so-called vocabulary book, which had no binding at all, and anxiously asked. Yes, Klein answered very simply. He wasn't trying to comfort Freja. Although it wasn't the kind of items Daisy carried around all the time, it was something that had accompanied her all this while. Moreover, it had been projected with Daisy's strong will. It was excellent for using it as dowsing to seek her out. He casually flipped through the vocabulary book and said, then I'll start taking action. The earlier I find Daisy, the better. Liv and Freja were unable to find words to describe their feelings. All they could do was watch as Klein and Old Kohler leave, repeating the words, thank you, Mr. Detective, and, thank you, good gentleman. After leaving the apartment, Klein turned to Old Kohler and said, you should pay attention to those female textile workers who lost their jobs, especially those who have neither found new jobs nor become street girls, and pay more attention to those who have gone off to unknown places. Pay attention to your own safety. Ask less and listen more. If you do this well, you'll get a bonus. All right. Old Kohler nodded heavily. He didn't immediately bid farewell. After hesitating for a moment, he asked with a tone full of expectation, "You'll find Daisy, won't you, Mr. Detective?" "I can only say that I will do my best." Klein didn't make any guarantees. Old Kohler sighed and smiled bitterly. "I've lost my child, so I'm very unwilling to see this sort of thing happen." He waved his hand and walked towards another street. Klein left the area at a leisurely pace, wrapping Daisy's vocabulary book around the head of the cane and, without attracting any attention, completed a dowsing rod seeking. There are results. Towards the northwest. For the time being, it's not possible to confirm if I'm suffering any interference or misdirection. He looked down at the direction in which the cane was going to fall and put out his palm to steady it. According to the revelation, Klein went all the way out of East Borough and hired a rental carriage. Half an hour later, the carriage, which occasionally changed directions, stopped at Iris Street, near Sherwood Borough and West Borough. It stopped in front of a house with a vast lawn, a wide garden, a small fountain square, and a marble statue. At this moment, Klein's cane had fallen down inside the carriage and was aimed straight at that direction. Through the window, Klein could see the guards patrolling inside the gates and ferocious dogs with their tongues out. The security inside was quite tight. More importantly, even without using divination, his spiritual intuition made him sense that there was great danger hidden within. What is this place? How can Daisy's disappearance involve such a dangerous place? Klein thought for a few seconds, then he told the carriage driver to keep going. The carriage driver replied with some surprise, "Sir, are you not here to visit Mr. Capim?" Capim? The name sounded extremely familiar to Klein. He smiled and asked, "Why do you think so?" "There will always be people coming out from East Borough who ride in my carriage all the way here." This is the home of the rich and powerful Mr. Capim," the carriage driver casually replied. "East Borough. Capim. Tycoon." Klein suddenly remembered who Capim was. There were many rumors that he was the leader of a bloody criminal organization which was stained with blood. He was involved in the disappearance of many innocent girls. And in reality, he was a tycoon who knew quite a few important figures. Without another word, Klein leaned back against the wall and half closed his eyes. The horse carriage slowly moved forward. The luxurious villa was left behind as it disappeared from the window. In a small booth in a coffee shop. Furs already knew that the old man across her was called Lawrence Nord, who came from Mid-Seashire's Constant City and was a public school teacher. He didn't know that Mrs. Elisa's husband was dead, nor that Mrs. Elisa had inherited his estate and become a beyonder, much less know that Mrs. Elisa had left me her relics. Could he also be a beyonder? Does he have the ability to divine? After taking a sip of Fermo coffee, she organized her words and said, "I was a doctor at the nearby Yosifov clinic, and Mrs. Elisa came to see me often. That was when her husband, Mr. Labero, had already passed away. Sometimes I would accompany her by chatting with her and helping her do things like. So in the end, she made a will, giving me her savings and cash. She donated jewelry, books, furniture, and other things to a charity. This was done under the supervision of her assigned law firm." Furs was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Lawrence pinched his forehead and said, "What a pity. I don't understand why Elisa didn't contact me over all those years." "She didn't mention your name." "She was vaguely dissatisfied with Mr. Labero's family," Furs replied frankly. Lawrence fell silent for a moment before saying, "Thank you for informing me. It has made me understand certain things. By the way, where are Labero and Elisa buried?" "Grim Cemetery." Furs took out a pocket watch and gave it a look before saying, "Mr. Lawrence, I still have things to tend to. I should be leaving." Lawrence didn't stop her. He got up and saw her off. After sitting down again, he rubbed his temples in distress and silently muttered to himself, "Labero is dead, and he didn't leave any children behind, and I don't know what Elisa did to his Beyonder characteristic. Richard died at the hands of the Aurora Order. Sam doesn't even wish to contact us at all, having no interest in shouldering the responsibility of the family name. Will the Abraham family slowly disappear like this? Chapter 374. Artificial Sleepwalking. Lawrence sat in the coffee shop booth, unable to stop himself from thinking about the hardships of the Abraham family over the years. Ever since they had split up into smaller families and settled in other places, the elder council's control over the family members hit rock bottom. A great number of Abrahams refused to advance, in order to avoid the effects of the curse, hence, many of them remained at sequence 8 or 9. Some didn't even attempt to become Beyonders, wishing to be ordinary people with a certain amount of knowledge so as to live a calm and peaceful life. The Elder Council believed that this was an act of forgetting the family's honor, but it couldn't be harsh on such actions since it was tantamount to self-destruction. In such a situation, the upper echelons of the Abraham family began to think of introducing changes. They imitated the teacher-apprentice inheritance system of the life school of thought, and they trained non-family members, hoping that once they advanced to become high-sequence Beyonders, then they would, in turn, be able to help the Abraham family deal with the curse that had existed for about 1,500 years and find their ancestor, Bethel Abraham, who had vanished in the War of the Four Emperors. The plan started off smoothly, and the apprentices who didn't have to worry about the curse quickly became stronger and stronger under the Abraham family's meticulous nurturing. Within a short period of 10 years, there were several strong sequence 5 individuals among them, while not a single person among the direct descendants of the Abraham family was sequence 6. The trunk was too weak, but the branches were too strong, hence, the seeds of tragedy were planted, and the ambitious apprentices began casting their sights on the powerful sealed artifacts that the Abraham family possessed. Their plot failed, but it also resulted in serious repercussions. All the non-family members at sequences 6 and 5 were of the opinion that their positions within the Abraham family didn't match their own strength and that they couldn't be trusted, preventing them from being in possession of certain sealed artifacts. In the process of going back and forth, with difficult negotiations occurring and compromises between the two parties, an accident happened. One of them, Traveler Bodis, was lured by the true creator into joining the Aurora Order, which led to a terrible disaster. In this disaster, the upper echelons of the Abraham family were almost completely destroyed. More than half of the few powerful sealed artifacts were lost, and only 3 were left. As a result, Lawrence's brother, who he shared the same mother with, Richard, died. Not only did Bodis benefit greatly from it, but he also gathered all the Beyonder ingredients he needed, and with the help of the true creator, he successfully overcame the dangers and became a demigod, becoming one of the 5 saints of the Aurora Order, the Saint of Mystery. After the disaster, the rebuilt Abraham family's elder council reflected over the actions of the past few years, but they couldn't find a solution to the problem. Emotions such as negativity, dejection, and hopelessness shrouded the hearts of the few remaining family members. Lawrence didn't wish to be placed in such an environment or face sighing and repressed emotions every day. He found a reason to leave the elder council and came to Backlund to look for his other brothers, Labero, who he shared the same mother, and Sam, who he didn't share the same mother. But now, he suddenly realized that he was the only one remaining from his father's line. He was already nearly 80 years old, and all his children had died in the disaster brought about by Bodis. Just recalling the past made him feel sorrow from the bottom of his heart. The most painful thing was that he couldn't see the hope for revenge, and he couldn't see the dawn of his clan's glory appearing once more. I'm already very old, and I was also injured before. Unless it's absolutely necessary, I wouldn't dare to use my Beyonder powers anymore, which would cause me to lose control or even cause the curse to descend. What is the future of the Abraham family? Lawrence took a sip of the Fermo coffee and fell into a long silence. Upon returning to her rented house, Furs immediately entered the bedroom and locked the wooden door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, calmed her mind, and whispered the honorific name that represented hope and the future. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, you are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. I wish to inform you of what I have encountered today. I met the elder brother of the husband of the old lady who made me become an apprentice. He seems to be a member of a certain family. I didn't mention anything related to mysticism, but I'm worried that he has extremely powerful divination abilities and will be able to find out the complete truth." At this moment, Klein happened to be above the gray fog. He saw the crimson star that represented the magician expanding outward, rippling as he heard the stacked layers of pleas. After figuring out the details, Klein tapped the edge of the ancient table and said to himself silently, "How cautious for her to know to seek help from the fool. Besides, your guess isn't wrong. The corresponding sequence 7 for apprentice is astrologer." Having recently read the Book of Secrets thoroughly, he had quickly come up with a plan that would help him interfere with divination through rituals. "I have to say, with the Book of Secrets and my advancement to sequence 7, I'm becoming more and more godlike when above the gray fog. Of course, for the time being, I'm still just an empty shell. Speaking of which, I've been acting in front of Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man several times, fooling them completely. Why didn't I receive any feedback from my spirituality? The speed at which I digest the potion doesn't seem to be getting faster as a result. Does it have to happen in the real world? Yes, it might be possible that their applause, as an audience, has been blocked by the gray fog, preventing them from directly affecting me. Just like how the eternal blazing sun and the true creator are unable to penetrate the gray fog to find this mysterious space. From the looks of it, the reaction between the gray fog and this mysterious space is very mechanical. It's not sentient enough, and it lacks intelligence. However, to me, this is actually a good thing." In the midst of his thoughts, Klein turned his knowledge into an ancient piece of goatskin and threw it into the crimson star that symbolized the magician. A boundless grayish-white fog suddenly filled the air in front of Furza's eyes, and an illusory yellowish-brown goatskin descended from the sky. When she saw the information written on it, she suddenly felt at peace. With Mr. Fool, Mr. Lawrence certainly wouldn't be able to get the correct revelations via divination. Furz sincerely expressed her gratitude and busily prepared for the ritual. She had seen a lot of instances where evil spirits did harm to others. In fact, she didn't trust the fool that much, but the curse of the full moon forced her to rely on him. "Regardless of how bad the consequences are, I will just lose my life. Without the help of Mr. Fool, I would have already lost control during the last blood moon and become a monster. Every day I live is a day gained. This is all given to me by Mr. Fool, and he can take it back at any time. Well, it's best if he doesn't." Furz took a breath and lit the 2 candles that symbolized the fool. The initial steps of the ritual were no different from those she had mastered before. This continued until the candles were lit and the essential oils, extract, and herbal powder were thrown into the fire. When the fragrance of a serene etherealness filled the room, a faint, illusory fog covered the entire altar. According to the contents of the goatskin, Furz quickly adjusted her body and mind, entered cogitation and chanted the corresponding name of the fool over and over again. Such monotonous, repetitive behavior allowed the originally calm and relaxed Furz to slowly enter a state where the mind was in deep sleep while her spirituality dispersed. Her entire being felt groggy, but she maintained a strange sense of lucidness. She felt as if her spirit was floating about, constantly moving upwards. This was similar to the secret deed process that was formed with the help of an external object, but it was different in many ways. This was a technique in mediumship and was used to communicate with higher-level spirits. At an extremum, it could even allow a beyonder to travel the spirit world under the pretext of maintaining a special lucidness. Some beyonders who specialized in influencing the mind called it artificial sleepwalking. They could use techniques such as hypnosis to make ordinary people enter this state as well. In that way, an ordinary person would appear to be in a deep slumber, yet they would be able to answer questions. Although their eyes and mouths were closed, they could detect the presence of various spirit bodies around them, thus, completing a certain degree of communication. The reason why Klein didn't let Furs use the secret deed ritual was that it could only give knowledge or direct effects such as purification or corruption, letting the target's mind gain a wonderful experience. It couldn't interfere with the divination or other matters done by another person. Simply put, the secret deed ritual directly affected the target's spirit body, astral projection, body of heart and mind, and ether body. The related positive or negative states were removed, and with the artificial sleepwalking ritual, it allowed Klein to do something indirect so as to deal with any outside interference. In a daze, Furs felt herself drifting back to the majestic old palace above the grey fog, and she saw Mr. Fool sitting high above, looking down at everything. Klein looked at the image of the magician projected by the dark red starlight. He unhurriedly picked up a paper figurine that he had found earlier from his trash pile in the corner. As a seer who had advanced twice, he had many ways to interfere with the divination of others, so he didn't need to rely on mystical items to help him. At this moment, due to the effects of the ritual, the mysterious space above the grey fog started to tremble slightly, and some of the power was flowing due to the perturbation. Klein's left hand pressed the Dark Emperor card on the surface of the long bronze table, connecting it with his own spirit body and uplifting himself to a higher level. It raised his level just like the previous times he used the flaring sun charm and Azek's copper whistle to solidify his spirit body. Then, with a flick of his right wrist, he threw the paper figurine out. The paper figurine suddenly expanded in size, and on its back, 12 pairs of black angel wings which were cut out of paper grew out. The feathers were vivid and lifelike. The paper angel pierced through the dark red light and overlapped with the illusory figure of the magician. Without any warning, it started to burn and completely disappeared. The half-awake Furs seemed to see a dignified and majestic angel as it wrapped layer upon layers of pitch-black wings around her. After an unknown period of time, Furs suddenly awoke from her artificial sleepwalking state. In front of her were only the 3 candles quietly burning on the altar and the fog that had permeated the entire room. At the tip of her nose was the familiar fragrance of serene etherealness. Angel. Furs was so lost in thought that she momentarily forgot to end the ritual. Chapter 375, An Evil Gods, Impressive Act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there were 12 pairs of wings. According to the canon descriptions of the various churches, that's an angel of the highest rank. Furs tried to recall what she had seen in her reverie. She was both shocked and not that shocked, as if what she had encountered was a shocking event that she had previously taken for granted but had simply never encountered before. It isn't surprising that Mr. Fool has the services of an angel. From the fact that Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man occasionally use the word him to refer to him, one can imagine so. The fact that he's able to isolate the effects of the moon's ravings allows me to infer. However, my request was only to interfere with Mr. Lawrence's divination, yet, he actually made an angel protect me. Isn't this too extravagant? Or is this a routine act for him? One more problem. Why are the feathers on the angel's wings black? Does this signify degeneracy or death? What is the true identity of Mr. Fool? Which great being is he? Death, who was rumored to have died in the Pale Era. He wishes to be reborn through the tarot gatherings. Furs suddenly took a deep breath, completely unconcerned that the gentleman named Lawrence would find anything wrong with her through his divination. On the realization that she had already joined the tarot club, she smiled wryly and whispered silently, "I can only do as Emperor Roselle said, take things one step at a time." After gathering her thoughts, Furs humbly thanked Mr. Fool once more. Following the normal process of a ritual, she extinguished the 3 candles' flame and began to clear the altar, which was filled with all kinds of items. Above the grey fog, Klein temporarily put the matter of the Abraham family at the back of his mind. According to his original plan, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the following divination statement: Daisy's current situation. Putting the fountain pen away, Klein stacked Daisy's vocabulary book and the piece of paper with the divination statement on it and held them in his left hand. Then, leaning back in his chair, he entered a state of cogitation, reciting the words, Daisy's current situation, over and over again. After 7 times, Klein fell asleep, his eyes black with a hint of red before grayness surfaced in them. One scene after another began to flash. Some were contiguous, some had gaps, and some were completely incoherent. Klein saw Liv's youngest daughter, a 13 or 14-year-old girl who persisted despite being repeatedly scalded. She was dragged into a remote alley by a man wearing a heavy jacket and a grayish-black cap after he covered her mouth with a handkerchief from behind. Another man, who was dressed the same, took her legs, and they lifted her as they quickly walked away. Their destination was the carriage parked outside the alley. The whole incident was over in less than 2 minutes, and by the time Daisy's sister, Freja, returned to search for Daisy, the carriage was already gone. Within the carriage, a sharp, ice-cold dagger was held to the muddle-headed Daisy's face, and lewd threats rang in her ears. The carriage drove into the luxurious villa. Daisy was in a small, dark room, and from time to time, the sound of women's cries, screams, and curses echoed outside. Daisy woke up and cried out for help, but the door was opened, and she was kicked away. The pain made it impossible for her to get up. She wept as she constantly cried for Mother and Freja. Klein opened his eyes and realized that the paper he held in his left hand had already been crumpled by his tight grip. He had established that Capim was the mastermind behind the many disappearances of young ladies and that he was the boss of a criminal organization. The problem, however, was that the case shouldn't and couldn't involve powerful Beyonder forces. At most, there would be a few money-hungry Beyonders at sequence 7, 8, or 9 that were helping out. It wouldn't have made Klein's spiritual intuition give him warnings of intense danger the moment he approached the villa. Is Capim himself a sequence 6 or even sequence 5 Beyonder? However, it's not difficult for a Beyonder of this level to earn money. There's no need to do such dirty and complicated matters. He just has to find all the gangs and collect protection fees via a protection racket. It would be easy, and it wouldn't dirty his hands. Could there be some hidden plot behind Capim's human trafficking? As he pondered, Klein used the power of the gray fog to restore Daisy's vocabulary book to its original state. After a few seconds of silence, he took out another piece of goatskin and wrote a new divination statement: Saving Daisy is a dangerous matter. After reading it carefully twice, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist, letting the topaz pendant fall and hang above the surface of the paper, almost to the point of touching the statement. After taking a few seconds to compose himself, he closed his eyes and began to recite the divination statement he had just written. When he finished reciting it, Klein opened his eyes and looked at the pendulum in his left hand. The topaz pendant was rotating clockwise at a fairly fast frequency and with a rather high amplitude. This meant that saving Daisy was a rather dangerous act. However, it isn't one of total despair. There's still a possibility, a significant chance of success, as long as I can seize it. Klein deciphered the revelation from the spirit pendulum. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Wasn't I looking for an opportunity to perform? This is it. As a magician, I have to challenge something of a higher difficulty. Otherwise, I would be called a trick master and not a magician. Completing the seemingly impossible, even if the outcome is nothing but an illusion, that's the image of a magician in my heart. As for whether it's one of the rules or not, I still need confirmation." Klein tapped the edge of the ancient table and quickly made his decision. To him, the most troubling thing about saving Daisy and dealing with Capim was that he didn't know anything about Capim. He didn't know how many other Beyonders were in the villa or the sequences and pathways they had. This made Klein unable to make specific preparations. And for a magician, the first rule was, never perform unprepared. Many seemingly impromptu performances actually involved significant preparations. For example, long periods of practice or thorough mastery of diverting attention away from the situation. Should I get Miss Justice's help to learn more about Capim's background for my adorer? Klein seriously considered the options available to him. However, he quickly rejected this idea. No, I won't be able to receive detailed information. Although Capim is involved with many powerful figures and the wealthy, it's not something that can be publicized. Miss Justice will, at most, learn of the nobles, members of parliament, or civil servants which he is involved with, but she won't be able to determine how many Beyonders are in his villa, much less the traps or the layout. Through the clues from these connections, Miss Justice might be able to figure out what I wish to know given a few weeks' time, but that's too slow. Rescuing Daisy needs to be done as soon as possible. Any delays will result in a tragedy. Klein's eyes swept across the surface of the long bronze table and onto the junk pile in the corner. His mind began to formulate an idea. On the one hand, I can get Miss Magician and her friend, Miss Zio, to investigate Capim's background and determine which Beyonders he has ties with. The two ladies are very well connected in East Borough, several gangs, and a considerable number of Beyonder circles. On the other hand, I can take action by myself. I can obtain information from the servants or bodyguards that come out from Capim's villa via mediumship. After finalizing his plan, Klein was in no hurry to get help from Miss Magician. He decided to try doing it by himself first so that he could find out more about the matter in a targeted manner. In the blink of an eye, his figure disappeared from the towering palace above the gray fog. After lunch, a man wearing a grayish-black cap and a thick cotton coat cautiously left from the back door of Capim's villa. He walked all the way to a crossroad and got into a rental carriage. East Borough. He touched the dark red birthmark on his face and instructed the carriage driver. The carriage began to move, and the man looked out of the window with a bored expression, admiring the beautiful ladies and young ladies on the streets. If only we could kidnap them, the man let his imagination run wild as he revealed a regretful expression. When he was far from Iris Street, he suddenly shivered, and his eyes became slightly dazed. He knocked on the wall and said to the carriage driver, "Stop, stop. I forgot something. Here will do." The carriage driver didn't dare to reprimand the ferocious man. He didn't even mutter as he stopped the carriage by the side of the street and allowed him to alight. After paying 6 pence for the ride, the man retraced the direction in which he came for dozens of meters before entering a cheap hotel. Without the need for any proof of identity, he paid for a room. After entering, he left the door ajar without locking it. Then, the man sat on the edge of the bed with a deadpan expression. Suddenly, a transparent and illusory figure separated from his body. It was none other than Klein, who was dressed as a worker. He had used the method of summoning himself to transform into a spirit body and had attached himself to this man's body, allowing him to walk to a convenient location for mediumship. After knocking the man out, Klein's spirit form disappeared from the room. Not long after, the door was pushed open, and he walked into the room in his corporeal form. Using a wall of spirituality to seal the place, Klein quickly set up a mediumship ritual, allowing the alluring scent of Amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine to emanate in the surroundings. After finishing his preparations and just as he was about to start the mediumship, he suddenly exclaimed and stopped his actions. He discovered that the spirit body of the man who was unconscious on the bed had a mysterious, unknown restriction. If he forcefully did the mediumship, although there was a high probability of success, it would activate the seal and cause some Beyonder to notice this occurrence. This would end up alerting the enemy. Such a strange Beyonder power. Very cautious and very careful. What Capim is involved in isn't simple at all. Klein took a few steps forward, frowning slightly. He glanced at the unconscious man and suddenly chuckled. "Do you think you can stop me with just this?" He quickly suspended the ritual, summoned himself again, and responded to himself. A few seconds later, he flew out of the candle's flame in his spirit body form and floated in the room once more. Without any hesitation, Klein, in his spirit body form, suddenly approached and possessed the unconscious man. The man suddenly sat up and opened his eyes, his expression appeared lifeless. He straightened his body, walked to the front of the altar, step by step, and then chanted in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, you are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Chapter 376, Mr. Harras. In a room filled with the ethereal fragrance of amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine, Capim's henchman, who had been possessed by Klein, was made to chant the fool's honorific name. Amidst the monotonous yet rhythmic murmurs and the fragrance that made it difficult to focus, the man's spirit body gradually dissipated. He became muddle-headed but maintained a certain degree of unusual lucidity, as if he was hypnotizing himself. With Klein's help, in his spirit body form and the feedback from the chanting the fool's honorific name, he slowly entered an artificial sleepwalking state. His astral projection approached the infinitely high gray fog and the mysterious location above the gray fog. Klein seized the opportunity, ended the summoning, and returned to the towering ancient palace, where he sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He saw a bright light circle rippling around him, sketching out the illusory figure of Capim's henchman. The mysterious space was affected by the ritual as it trembled slightly. Some of the energy was being pried away and was slowly flowing. Klein picked up the Dark Emperor card, and a paper figurine flashed in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, the paper figurine flew out and absorbed the sliver of energy that had been pried out of the gray fog. It then transformed into a man wearing a black cap and a thick cotton jacket. He looked identical to Capim's henchman, even his aura and feel was indistinguishable from the real person. This paper figurine overlapped with the target's illusory figure and helped him resist the mysterious and unknown restrictions placed within his spirit body. At the same time, Klein held the Dark Emperor card and spread his spirituality, touching the projection of Capim's henchman formed by the pure light. This was one of the applications of secret deeds, where a weak human and a great being were able to be a little in tune with each other, feeling the corresponding knowledge and gaining a wonderful spiritual experience. Unlike normal circumstances, Klein was playing the role of the great being in this instance. In this kind of close interactive state that belonged to a secret deed, humans could gain knowledge from great existences, and great existences could also naturally use questions to obtain the information they wanted. If it wasn't for Klein's inability to master the field of the mind, he would have been able to plant an inducing suggestion. What kind of powerful people are in Capim's villa? Klein asked through the interactive spirituality state. Without any resistance, the projection transmitted the memories to Klein, making him feel like he was watching a holographic film. The man in the cap stood respectfully and fearfully in the room. In front of him was a middle-aged gentleman in a black tailcoat and a white wig. This gentleman had a long, thin, and stern face, and his mouth was naturally pursed, giving off an exceptionally cold feeling. He followed the golden chain on his watch, took out a pocket watch of the same color, pressed it open to take a look, and then he said in a deep voice, "Look at me." The man in the cap didn't dare to disobey as he raised his head and looked in front of him. "Yes, Mr. Harras." Before he could finish his words, he saw a pair of eyes that flickered with a strange light, and he heard a command, "Maintain secrecy. You can't leak anything you see or hear in this villa to anyone else." The man in the cap trembled inexplicably, feeling that he had to do as the other party had ordered. He lowered his head again and said, "Yes, Mr. Harras." The man in the cap carried an unconscious girl along the stairs to the entrance of the basement. There was a small room that was separated from the others, and a bearded man with an unknown age was sitting inside it. This bearded man had a pair of frighteningly cold blue eyes. He held a thin piece of flannel in his hand and was carefully cleaning the grayish-white rifle on the table. The rifle was thick and long, connected through a pipe to a large mechanical box of the same color. It was a high-pressure steam rifle. That was a military-controlled item. Mr. Belize, the man in the cap bowed his head in greeting. The man in the cap entered a neatly arranged underground structure which resembled a prison. He then locked the unconscious girl in one of the small rooms. He locked the door, returned to the corridor, and picked up the lantern he had been assigned. At that moment, he saw a figure slowly approaching from the other end of the corridor. The figure seemed to be able to see through the darkness without any lighting. With the aid of the lantern, the man in the cap realized that it was a woman in her 30s. The woman was wearing a brown bonnet, a thin white blouse, and suspenders, as well as leather boots that reached her knees. There were old scars on her face and a cruel smile at the corners of her mouth. The man in the cap lowered his head in fear as he stammered, "Ma'am Katie." The woman ignored him. Step by step, she approached him and walked past him, as though he was nothing more than air. When the lady named Katie had left, the man in the cap curled his lips and said, "Bitch. When you get into bed, you'll definitely be more energetic than a prostitute." He pushed up his crotch, held up the lantern, and left the basement. The man in the cap met two men in the grand hall that shimmered gold. One of them was about 1.65 meters tall, and he was a little plump. He didn't have any special features, but his eyes always had a frightening look. The other was slightly taller than 1.70 meters, and he looked a bit old. He had some wrinkles and a high nose bridge. His brown eyes were filled with spirit, and he didn't seem to have a look of deterrence. "Mr. Capim," the man in the cap greeted the plump middle-aged man, then he said to another person, "Mr. Parker." In the early light of dawn, the man in the cap met the cold middle-aged gentleman called Mr. Harras at the entrance to the basement. Harras, wearing a white hood, glanced at him, who was standing respectfully by the side. He indifferently stretched out his right palm towards the entrance of the basement and solemnly said, "Confinement." Silently, there was a subtle difference in the surroundings. There are a total of 4 beyonders. At least 4 of them. The strongest should be that Mr. Harras, a sequence 6 at the very least, or maybe even sequence 5. I wonder what pathway it is. It does seem similar to the Dark Emperor pathway. Relying on order and issuing commands? Judging from the scenes just now, the restrictions pertain only to the basement, not the entire villa. That's right. With so many people coming and going during the day, it would be too troublesome to enter and exit once the restrictions are in place. I wonder if it's the same at night. Klein analyzed the information he had just received and asked again, "What's the overall layout of the villa?" He quickly received feedback and saw a magnificent hall, a wide dining room, connected corridors, washrooms, and scenes of the basement. Through them, Klein pieced together in his mind the rough layout of Capim's villa. Feeling the drain on his spirituality, he asked a final question: who are the important figures whom Capim is closely related to? The scene in front of his eyes was the magnificent hall from before. Half-naked girls were prostrating themselves while serving the guests drinks, letting them abuse them or fool around with them, otherwise, they were being dragged directly to a secluded spot to be ravaged. They were young, and their faces were bitter and numb. Any slight delay or lack of enthusiasm would result in them being whipped by Capim's attendants or maidservants. None of these servants showed a shred of sympathy despite seeing such evil scenes. They fought to be the first to showcase themselves in a bid to obtain rewards. Klein saw Capim among the guests, the cold Mr. Harras, and a member of parliament from the House of Commons who often appeared in the newspapers, Vardara, a fat man who was addressed as deputy chief. Is that one of the deputy chiefs of the Backlund Police Department? That's one of the higher-ups of the police department. To think that not a single one of those servants are good. That's understandable. The villa's hired personnel must have been screened before and would have to be sufficiently trustworthy. Klein rubbed his forehead, halting the secret deed ritual. The man in the cap was only an inconsequential leader, and that was all he could know or participate in. Even at this moment, the mysterious restriction on him was still unperturbed. Klein ended the ritual and allowed him to vanish from above the grey fog as he returned to the real world. He sat by the bed and looked at the man in the cap who was unconscious. According to the information he had just gathered, he analyzed the feasibility of a performance and considered one plan after another. In the end, Klein came up with a definite idea. He whispered to himself, "Perhaps, I don't need a helper. A helper would drag me down instead, making it inconvenient for me to escape in times of danger. Picking the right time is very important." Nearly 50 minutes later, the man in the blackish-gray cap appeared in East Borough as he headed straight for the streets controlled by the Zmanger gang. As soon as he saw a few dark-skinned, lean people with ferocious looks, he immediately went close. Pretending to not watch where he was going, he bumped into one of them. "Damn it! You bunch of trash," the man in the cap cursed loudly and punched at one of them. Highlanders, who loved to fight, didn't back down and entered a brawl with him. In the process, the man in the cap pulled out his dagger, and the other Highlanders also drew their weapons. Slash! During the battle, a dagger stabbed into the capped man's neck as he failed to dodge in time. It went right into his arteries. The man in the cap fell as red blood pooled around his head. He quickly lost his life, and the illusory, transparent figure within his body immediately vanished. Klein returned above the grey fog, and using it as a springboard, he re-entered his body. He then opened his eyes in the cheap hotel in Sherwood Borough. He cleaned up the rest of the evidence and went to the front desk to check out of the room. On his way back to Minsk Street, Klein once again went above the grey fog. He wanted to divine a simple but crucial piece of information. He picked up a fountain pen and wrote down a line of text: "Capim's dinner time today." Chapter 377, Capim's dinner. Putting down his dark red fountain pen, Klein picked up the piece of paper with the divination statement and leaned back in his chair. His lips moved as he whispered, "Capim's dinner time today," over and over again. Klein's voice echoed above the empty grey fog as his eyes rapidly turned dark, and his eyelids drooped. In a fragmented dreamscape, he saw the spacious, elegant dining room where there was gilded porcelain cutlery, caviar, roasted chicken, lamb stew, fried ribeye steak, deep-fried dragon bone fish, thick creamy soup, and so on. The food was placed in a certain order according to specific requests in front of several diners. Among them was the slightly plump Capim, the middle-aged gentleman in a white hood, Harras, the thin-bloused Katie, and Parker, whose face was rather unintimidating due to his old age. Looking out from the end of the dining table, he could see a window decorated with gorgeous decorations. Outside the window, the clouds were sparse, and the crimson moon was faintly discernible in the air. Klein opened his eyes and marked the location of the moon in his dream. Using his knowledge in astromancy, he quickly calculated a rough corresponding time. It looks like it's from 7:30 to 7:45 in the evening. Considering those few scenes, Capim and the others have already finished more than half their meals, so I can push the time back by another 15 minutes. That way, 7:30 is the best choice. Klein muttered silently to himself as he interpreted the revelation from his dream divination. Eating at 7:30 was not a rare occurrence. This was even considered mainstream in the Lone Kingdom and even the Northern Continent because many middle-class people, either due to their personal situations or because of low rent, lived in the suburbs and had to commute to work by taking the short-distance steam locomotive. By the time they got home, it was usually after 7 in the evening, so it was normal for people to have dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Klein had had the same experience in Tianjin City, but that was because he had no servants and no housewife. Once the three siblings returned home, they still needed to busy themselves for quite a while before they could enjoy any hot food. It wasn't because they lived far from work. This was why civilians and the poor often had dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. As lunch and dinner were separated by quite some time, afternoon tea, which should have belonged to the upper-class citizens, became popular among the middle-class citizens and civilians. When he finished the interpretation, Klein recalled the revelation he had just received. Klein became acutely aware of a problem. Where were Capim's wife and children? They didn't appear in the dining room. Is Capim an extreme believer in the Lord of Storms, so his wife and children have to eat their meals in the activity room? Or is there another reason? Or could he be unmarried and childless? He's already a middle-aged man. Klein tried to divine the situation, but he failed to receive any effective revelations, so he gave up. 7:30, he repeated the time once more before returning to the real world. In the evening, even at home, Capim, who was wearing a formal bow tie, narrowed his eyes and looked at his subordinates before him. He asked in a slow but chilling voice, "Fabian is dead?" "Yes, boss." Even though he had been working with Capim for many years, his subordinates still felt fear and horror. "Odysseus, call me Mr. Mr. In a few years, you'll have to call me Sir Capim." Capim loosened his bow tie and casually handled a thick cigar. "When did Fabian die? How did he die?" "This afternoon, I sent him to East Borough to do something. He ended up in a conflict with the Zmanger gang and got stabbed in the neck," Odysseus described in a trembling voice. Capim, who was toasting the cigar, said in an unperturbed tone, "Fabian is really a fool. But are the Zmanger gang fools to not know that he's my subordinate? Mister, as you know, Highlanders often join the Zmanger gang when they arrive in East Borough, and they're barbaric and reckless, and they don't give a shit who's who," Odysseus quickly explained. Capim snorted. "Have they forgotten that this isn't the Highlands? Or have they forgotten who I am? Odysseus, I want the body of the Zmanger gang's leader from that block. Can you do it? If you can't, I'll sink your wife, your child, as well as you into the Tussock River." "Mister, no problem." Odysseus immediately raised his voice. He immediately asked in a low voice, "Who can I mobilize?" Capim was about to reply when the door suddenly opened and the middle-aged gentleman with a white wig, Harras, walked in. He gave Odysseus a cold glance before casting his gaze onto Capim. "I heard that one of your subordinates had a conflict with a gang in East Borough and ended up dying?" "Yes, Mr. Harras." Capim stood up, cigar in hand. Harras stared into Capim's eyes and said, "You want revenge on them?" Capim's forehead suddenly dripped with beads of sweat. "No, not at all. Mr. Harras, you misunderstand." Harras nodded slightly. "You have to remember that during this critical period, we have to try our best to not cause any trouble unless necessary." He paused for a second and observed Capim's reaction. "You are not the only human trafficker in Backland. We can support you, but we can also do so for others. You have to remember this point. The reason why I picked you was because you were vicious and shameless enough. However, you were extremely cautious. It wasn't because you were the biggest human trafficker." From the side, Odysseus listened to the duo's conversation. He wished that he was just a mass of air. That way, he didn't need to see how humble his boss, Capim, was. Without a trace of anger on his face, Capim smiled and said, "Mr. Harras, my main concern is that Fabian's death isn't simple. It might disrupt your plans." "No, there's nothing wrong with his death," Harras said in an affirmative tone. "I didn't get any feedback." "Is that so?" Capim acted enlightened. "Then I'm relieved." He looked at Odysseus and signaled him to leave. He then lowered his voice and said, "Mr. Harras, this time, there are the kind of goods you like from this batch." Seeing Harras's expression soften but not show any signs of emotion, Capim quickly added, "We've already finished gathering the ones that will be sent over." Harras nodded slowly. "Send her to my room tonight." "Yes, Mr. Harras," Capim said with a big smile. After Harras left, his face turned gloomy. He took a deep breath and whispered, I hope that you can keep your promise this time. I don't want to be involved in anything like that anymore. He clearly remembered that year during the harvest festival, someone had come to him, hoping to get a batch of innocent girls. From that day on, the trajectory of his life had undergone tremendous changes. He had taken a fifth of the market share of the unlawful slave trade. He quickly became one of Baklun's rather famous tycoons, acquainting himself with several important figures and dragging them into the abyss of depravity. At this point, he desperately wanted to cover up the sins of his past. He wanted to let Capim undergo a catharsis, allowing him to become a true member of the upper class. However, for the time being, he was unable to do so. Glancing at the cigar in his hand, he picked up the framed photograph of himself with a beautiful woman and 2 children. Rubbing the surface of the photo frame with his thumb, Capim narrowed his eyes and whispered to himself, "After this deal, you should be able to return." At dinner time, Capim walked out of his study, a warm smile plastered over his face again. "Ma'am Katie, there's your favorite caviar and a roast chicken specially prepared for you this evening," he said to the woman in the thin blouse. Katie touched the old scar on her face and nodded without saying a word. Capim knew that she was silent and fierce, so he didn't continue. He watched her as she took her seat. Then Harras, wearing a white wig, entered the dining room, nodding slightly to each of the diners. The elderly Parker took a sip of his pre-meal wine, smiling as he motioned for Capim to sit down. The white napkins were spread out, and the food was served one by one. Capim raised his glass and chuckled. "Holy Lord of Storms, let's toast to a beautiful future." "To a beautiful future," Parker responded. Harras didn't say a word. He merely held the wine glass in his hand and made a gesture. Katie completely ignored them. At this moment, the classical clock hanging in the hall read 7:23. In a cheap hotel in the Baklund Bridge area. The disguised Klein took out his golden pocket watch, looked at the exact time, then he took out holy night powder, and he sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. After doing that, he quickly set up an altar and conducted a ritual. I summon in my name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. When the ritual was over, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog, ready to respond to himself. Inside the towering and solemn palace, he saw the door of summoning condensed by rippling light. It was a pair of illusory doors that opened outwards, covered with mysterious symbols. Klein was in no hurry to be summoned. Instead, he took out the sun brooch and other mystical items, and he absorbed them into his spirit body according to his plan. Finally, he picked up the Dark Emperor card and let his spirit body envelop it. All of a sudden, Klein felt as if his spirit body had turned corporeal with flesh and blood. It was as if he could lift a gun and move a table and chair. A dark and ethereal mist rose up around him, and as the mist clung onto the surface of his body, it formed an imposing set of armor. He had a black crown on his head and a long cape of the same color on his back. At that moment, Klein was like an emperor about to embark on a journey. Dark Emperor. He examined the purifying bullets and revolver that he didn't bring with him before taking a step forward and entering the crack on the illusory door. Leaping out of the candlelight, he immediately flew under the cover of the night towards Capim's villa on Iris Street in Sherwood Borough. Not long after, he floated in front of the artificial fountain and approached the villa's entrance at a relaxed pace. The patrolling guards passed by him, but they didn't have any reaction. Since it wasn't really late into the night yet, there were no beyonders on guard outside. In addition, Klein wasn't afraid that the powerful beyonders inside would notice and have a premonition. It was because the Dark Emperor card possessed anti-divination and anti-prophecy characteristics. Chapter 378, The show begins with a black crown and a solid suit of armor. Klein stood in the doorway, attuned himself for a few seconds, and took a step forward. His seemingly physical body silently passed through the door and entered Capim's villa. The first thing that met him was a spacious hall with lots of chairs and clothes racks, and behind it was a magnificent hall with gold as the main color theme. There was no ceiling, only a dome reaching 3 stories high. A giant crystal chandelier hung down, and on each petal was a pearly white candle. Through a thick, heavy door to the left of the hall was an elegant and exquisite dining room. The fragrance of roasted meat was the richest inside, concealing the smell of alcohol and other food. Klein was in no hurry to enter the dining room. He partially circled the exterior first, occasionally reaching out his hand to pull on the grayish-white gas pipes. It appeared as if he was experimenting with his physical strength, after carrying the Dark Emperor card, to see how much of an impact he had on the real world. While he was a seer and clown, Klein's spirit body only had an intuition ability that was separate from divination. He possessed only 2 spell-like powers, which were to directly attack the soul and to freeze the target through contact. Once he advanced to the magician sequence, even if Klein didn't rely on the beyonder powers of his physical body, he could still use paper figurine substitutes and air bullets in his spirit body state. In addition, he began to be able to possess others and gain basic control of the target. Augmented by the Dark Emperor card, the strength of his spirit body increased, and the number of items he could carry increased. His spell-like powers, which could directly attack souls, evolved into a specter's shriek. It produced sound waves that were inaudible to humans but capable of damaging the souls of all living beings in the area. Similarly, the frozen effects derived from contact was clearly strengthened. After confirming everything, he found the corner of a wall and penetrated it to enter the dining hall. Then, suppressing all his emotions, he swept his eyes across the long table. The scene of Harras in his white wig, Katie in her thin blouse, Parker with his aged face drinking red wine, and the slightly plump Capim slicing his rib-eye steak caught his eye. Klein retracted his gaze quickly, not daring to look too much, lest the few beyonders would discover him via their spiritual perception. With the help of the spiritual glows from the male and female servants standing around him, that is, the color of their auras, he carefully circled around the dining room and figured out the exact layout. For example, the size of the dining room was equivalent to the total area of his living room, dining room, and activity room. Another example was that there was a fireplace that burned with charcoal. It warmed the entire room via a pipe. There were 16 elegant gas lamps, and their lighting mixed together, making the room appear like it was daytime. Across from the fireplace was a wall which had hanging picture frames. There were sketches and oil paintings, all works of famous artists. That bearded Belize isn't here. He should be changing shifts at the basement. For a beyonder to be willing to do such menial work, Capim is definitely not involved in a simple matter of human trafficking. Klein thought for a few seconds, then he leaned against an oil painting of the sunset. He reached his hand into his body and unscrewed a translucent brown bottle's cap. It was the biological poison bottle. The reason why he paid so much attention to the time and chose to arrive at dinner time was because, at this very moment, the main figures were gathered here in the most orderly manner. It was the most advantageous for him to use the biological poison bottle. And with the tightly shut doors and windows during early winter, it allowed the effects of biological poison bottle to be more effective and have faster effects. In addition, Klein didn't soak the biological poison bottle to concoct the prophylactic drug before he came. He was currently in his spirit body state, so he wasn't afraid of biological poisons. With his spirit body's concealment and containment, he stood there silently and patiently admiring each and every one of the elegant wall lamps which were connected to the grayish-white gas pipes. Quickly, the odorless poison swiftly emanated outwards. Harras, with his white wig, sliced up a deep-fried dragon-bone fish, dipped it in black pepper sauce, and stuffed it into his mouth. Chewing and swallowing, he picked up the faintly golden champagne that was bubbling like a string of beads and took a sip in a good mood. He couldn't help but think of the entertainment that he would be experiencing that evening, the the joy of a stubborn girl being conquered by him. This affected his appetite and made him unable to concentrate. Katie didn't get the servant to help her slice the roasted chicken. She was burying her head, holding a knife and fork, and like doing a precise dissection, she quickly divided the chicken into several pieces. They were all almost the same size. As Parker sampled the red wine and ate the stewed lamb, he would occasionally chat with Capim, who was sitting at the head of the table, and was considered as a guest that didn't sully the title. The dinner proceeded in an orderly manner, and finally, Capim put the last piece of beef into his mouth. He smiled at the three Beyonders and said, "Mr. Harras, Ma'am Katie, and Mr. Parker, tonight's desserts are from La Barrega's head chef. There are 3 kinds: fruit caramel pudding, cream shortcake, and the carrot cake." Harras, who had always been cold, nodded slightly. "We love dessert so much in this country." As soon as he finished his reflection, he saw Capim raise his hand and scratch his cheek before scratching again. "It's a little itchy." Capim smiled apologetically. Before he could finish his sentence, he couldn't help but scratch one more time, leaving a clear bloody mark on his face. The bloody mark quickly swelled up, and his skin turned translucent. One could even see yellowish pus inside. "It's really a bit itchy." Capim smiled again. He scratched the original spot again, but due to using excessive force, the swelling caused the translucent skin to split open, and pus with a nauseating smell sprayed out. Harras narrowed his eyes and shot to his feet, looking around warily. "Ha ha ha. Ha. Ha ha ha." At that moment, he heard exaggerated laughter, and his body suddenly tensed up. He saw a male and female servant holding onto their bellies, laughing out loud. They laughed so much that they couldn't even straighten their backs. Tears flowed out from their laughter caused the room to turn completely silent. Like a chain reaction, the rest of the servants fainted or vomited yellow-green liquid continuously without end. None of them were spared. Bam! Katie flipped the dining table, letting the gold-plated cutlery and leftover food and wine to spill onto the floor. She had a revolver and a soft black whip in her hands. Parker stood up as well, but his mind appeared adrift. He looked at Capim crying miserably for help as he kept scratching and forcefully tore off a few pieces of flesh. For some baffling reason, he felt that the other party's ugly and disgusting appearance was quite the fine sight. At that moment, Harras realized that he was a little out of breath and realized that the room was probably filled with poison. He growled, "Hold your breath. Parker, open the door. Katie, follow me to find the intruder." At this moment, Harras was grateful that the dinner had been enjoyed with Capim, and there were quite a few attendants around. These ordinary people's ability to resist poison was far inferior to Beyonders. The fact that they showed signs ahead of time had allowed them to detect that something was amiss even before the poison had reached the deepest part of their bodies. Parker, who has the lowest sequence, should be the one with the most severe symptoms among us. Harras suddenly had this thought. Creak. As Parker opened the door to ensure that the dining room was no longer sealed, Harras, relying on his spirit vision, discovered an illusory figure quietly fleeting around. The figure wore a thick and imposing black armor, and a pitch-black crown on his head. A mask of the same color covered his face, making him look like a king from the spirit world. It was none other than Klein. Harras raised his right hand and pointed at the black figure that couldn't be seen by ordinary people. He chanted in ancient Hermes, "Imprison." All of a sudden, the black figure's surroundings turned viscous, as though it had transformed into a giant amber or produced a sealed, transparent wall. The figure was rooted to the spot, hardly able to move. Katie had taken aim long ago, and she pulled the trigger. They worked well together. With 2 bangs, the light golden bullet, filled with strange patterns, penetrated the viscous air and hit the black figure. The bullet pierced through and struck the wall opposite. The black shadow self-ignited, reduced to a roughly cut paper figurine. Within the pale golden flames, the paper figurine was quickly reduced to ashes. Pa! With a strange, crisp snap, the light from the 16 elegant gas lamps in the fire burning quietly in the fireplace suddenly lit up, leaving Harras, Katie, and Parker with only a brief flash of red before their eyes. Soon after, all the flames were extinguished, leaving the dining room illuminated via the human height street lamps outside the window and the crimson moonlight shining through the layers of clouds. It made the place abnormally dark and silent. Harras and the others once again relied on their spirit vision and spiritual perception to search for the ghostly intruder. At the same time, he realized that the poison wasn't showing its effects fast enough. It wouldn't really flare up until he finished the enemy. Therefore, he paid attention to the movement at the entrance of the basement. He pointed at the door again and said in ancient Hermes, "Confinement." The entire dining room suddenly froze, as if there was an additional layer of an invisible wall that even spirit bodies couldn't penetrate. Harras wanted to make it impossible for the intruder to escape. "I've found you." Wielding the revolver in one hand and the whip in the other, Katie noticed a black figure floating in the air. A strange light flashed in her eyes, and before she could attack, her mind buzzed as if someone had struck her head with a wooden stick. She felt as if she had encountered an indescribable shriek. A few drops of sticky blood slowly dripped from the tip of her nose. Harras only felt slight dizziness while the symptoms of shortness of breath seemed to worsen. Parker, the weakest of them, was seeing stars, and his steps became unstable. Suddenly, someone patted Parker's shoulder. A cold and gloomy feeling gushed over, causing him to freeze on the spot. It was as if he was completely covered in ice, and the cold moisture seeped into his bones. A familiar, deep voice sounded in his ears. "Imprison." Parker was instantly trapped by the transparent wall that imprisoned the door. However, Klein didn't possess him and went straight through instead, avoiding the effects of Harras's spell in a timely manner. Harras narrowed his eyes and waved his right hand. "Release." Chapter 379, Magic's Key segment. The invisible prison around Parker's body immediately collapsed, leaving not even a single trace of it behind. However, he didn't regain his mobility. Instead, he slumped to the ground, shivering continuously, as if he was still frozen. This wasn't only an after-effect of soul touch, but also the effect of Klein's direct attack on his soul. Parker, who was only a sequence 8, was unable to recover in a short period of time. He couldn't even control his breathing and, as a result, inhaled large quantities of the biological poison, which was identical to the one in his body, once again. His weakened state caused the poison in his body to act faster. His eyes stared blankly as he instinctively changed direction. He saw Capim rolling on the ground and scratching his face and body constantly. He saw the thin strips of flesh hanging by the side of the wounds and the ghostly white color of his bones. Parker gasped and struggled to climb over. Capim, whose itch made him rip off the outer layer of his skin, suddenly discovered that Parker was crawling toward him with bloodshot eyes. He had a bad premonition, but he had no strength to dodge as he couldn't stop scratching. He didn't even have the ability to shout, "No," except for using a blood-curdling cry as a substitute. At this moment, Klein, who had dodged the "imprison" spell, shouted, "Holy," in ancient Hermes. Then, he rubbed his fingers together and shot an air bullet through the dark golden sunbird brooch's coruscating glow. As soon as the air bullet was formed, it took on a holy luster and shot straight towards Harras's face. This was the holy oath provided by the sun brooch, and Klein had augmented the air bullet with holy damage. Harras had long since changed his position. He was abnormally agile, and unlike a mage, he was more like a pugilist expert. As he avoided Klein's air bullet, he motioned for Katie to lash her whip to hold Klein back. When Klein's attack was interrupted, Harras took an iron-black metal glove from a hidden pocket of his and tried to put it on his left hand. In his spirit body state, Klein didn't need to look out from the corner of his eye to see what had just happened despite not facing Harras. He immediately flew up, avoiding Katie's lash. He flew over the chandelier and pounced towards Harras. When Harras saw this scene, he held the black metal glove and pointed diagonally upwards. Exile. Klein was suddenly hit by an overwhelming and invisible force. His entire spirit body was blown away by the wind and hit the wall conjured by confinement, but didn't penetrate through it and escape. Seizing this opportunity, Harras put on the iron black metal glove. In the blink of an eye, he seemed to grow a bit taller. His authority was uplifted like he was a figure that could determine the life and death of others. The moment Klein was released from the exile state, he felt an inexplicable sense of horror. He couldn't help but want to lower his head, to prostrate, to listen to Harras's every word and obey every order given by him. His movements had become sluggish, and his pupils reflected a rapidly approaching Katie. "Pa!" Katie lashed out with her long black whip and hit Klein accurately. The long whip passed through his spirit body, but it brought a great deal of pain to Klein's psyche, as if someone had pressed a red-hot iron to the weakest part of his body. He jerked his head up and let out a scream. As for Katie, she pulled the trigger of the revolver in her other hand. Bang! Bang! 2 bullets, with a light golden glow, shot out one after another, striking Klein's body. Bright rays of light bloomed, and the figure wearing black armor rapidly thinned, turning into a paper figurine and quickly burning into ashes. Klein appeared in a dark corner. The sun brooch inside his spirit body was glowing with a dark golden light. Warm powers instantly filled his body, and the extreme horror that Harras had subjected him to quickly disappeared. One of the spell-like effects of the sun brooch was horror immunity. In the short span of less than a minute, Klein had already been forced to use paper figurine substitutes twice. Although it was partly because he did it on purpose, it was still enough to prove the strength of Harras and Katie's joint attacks. It was enough to confirm the divination outcome which Klein had received. This operation would be quite dangerous. If Parker hadn't been temporarily crippled by the effects of the biological poison bottle and his initial surprise attack, the situation would have been even more dangerous. His plan was to rationally give up if all 4 paper figurines were used up and his opportunity had yet to appear. It wasn't because Klein didn't wish to prepare more substitutes, but because his spirituality could only afford 4 times while in combat. As for the confinement effect that Harras had created, Klein wasn't worried at all. He was now a spirit body that had been summoned. As long as he ended the summoning, he would immediately return above the gray fog. Unless it was intercepted by powers at the level of deities or the special effects of sealed artifacts at grade 0 or grade 1, nothing could interrupt this process. Previously, when Klein went to the Royal Museum to steal the Dark Emperor card, the woman who was suspected of being a high-sequence Beyonder was unable to stop him from leaving. This was the main reason why Klein dared to challenge the impossible even though he knew that the danger was great. Seeing that the enemy was no longer horrified, Harras put on his black metal gloves and signaled Katie to hold Klein back. He then pointed forward and solemnly said, "Spectres and wraiths are prohibited here." Klein's body that was covered in black armor immediately trembled as he was strongly repelled by a powerful, invisible force. However, the level of the Dark Emperor card was extremely high, causing the level of the spirit body to be relatively high as well. This kind of influence that was directly aimed at a particular existence was quickly suppressed. Harras narrowed his eyes, feeling that the intruding spectre was very strange. He saw that Klein easily escaped Katie's intervention via flight, so he pushed his palm forward again and announced in ancient Hermes, "Flying and floating are prohibited here." All of a sudden, Klein felt his body become heavy, and he plummeted from midair to the ground. Katie quickly rushed over, and with a flick of her wrist, she lashed out with the whip that directed torture on the mind and soul. She still had many Beyonder bullets on her, but there were fewer than 3 that were targeted for specters and wraiths. Therefore, she temporarily gave up on using the revolver and only relied on her auxiliary weapon. Klein rolled on the ground, skillfully dodging Katie's whip. He heard the crack of the whip as it hit the ground. Katie was about to sweep the whip when she felt an itch at her throat. She coughed twice and missed the opportunity to continue her relentless attack. This was a sign of the poison acting up. Harras took a deep breath, held his breath once more. He folded his wrist, pointed to himself, and said, "Disciplinary target, wraiths and specters." The surface of his body immediately emitted a light as bright as the morning sun. Even his fist began to shine with lustrous brilliances. Bam! The marble under Harras's feet cracked soundlessly, and his tall, thin body pounced swiftly and fiercely, allowing him to immediately close in on Klein. At this moment, he looked even more like a knight than Katie. Bam! He threw a punch forward, and the air seemed to explode. However, Klein had pulled back ahead of time, dodging the punch with the wind. Pow! Katie helped from the side and lashed out with her whip in the direction in which her enemy was dodging. This forced Klein to have no choice but to roll again and again. He took on a fighting stance while keeping an eye out for Harras's spell-like imprison. As lashing sounds echoed, Harras kept attacking while Katie aided him from the side. In less than 2 minutes, Klein was forced into an unavoidable situation. Even rolling was of no use. Pa! Katie's black whip lashed out at Klein's face, and he was only able to take one step sideways before being hit in the arm. That piercing pain attacked his psyche once again, causing him to freeze on the spot. Even his spirit body became somewhat thinner. Seizing this opportunity, Harras clenched his left fist and solemnly declared, "Death." His body then merged with some sort of strange force, creating an obvious afterimage as he slammed into Klein. Schwing! The figure covered in black armor instantly broke into pieces, turning into pieces of paper that fluttered in the air like a butterfly. Klein had expended his third paper figurine. Harras's gaze swept across the room and quickly locked onto the enemy that had appeared in the corner. He sneered and said, "Let me see how many substitutes you have left." In the process of searching for the enemy, he discovered that Parker was squirming on top of Capim. The scene was bloody and disgusting. It was a repulsive sight, both terrible and horrifying. However, Harras didn't have the luxury of time to save his subordinate. He was well aware that the effects of the poison would only worsen over time, so he had to get rid of the enemy as quickly as possible, so he couldn't be distracted. If he didn't, he would have to leave the dining hall first to recover from the poison, thus, allowing the enemy to escape without getting any useful information. He signaled Katie to go forward again, so as to hold back Klein, who couldn't fly or float. He took a breath and tried to catch a breather. There's a strange smell in the air. This is probably a result of the increasing toxicity of the poison. This thought flashed through Harras's mind, but he didn't think too much about it. He raised his left hand and solemnly declared, "The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime." An illegal intrusion. While repeating the statement for a second time, Harras found it hard to breathe again. For a moment, he was unable to catch his breath, so he could only stop midway. He took another deep breath, adjusted himself, and spoke again. "The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime." He repeated it 3 times, and Klein, who was still unable to extricate himself from Katie's entanglement, felt a baffling chill. Cough. 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 Katie showed coughing symptoms again, and the flailing of her whip became sluggish. Klein took the opportunity to stop the embroilment with her, but he didn't attack her. Instead, he raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a sharp cry that no human could hear. Hum. Katie's head jerked up, and her body swayed. She felt like the ground was bobbing up and down. Harras only felt a slight dizziness before returning to normal. He looked at Klein coldly and said in a majestic voice, "The guilty should be restricted." Klein, who was lunging at him, found to his surprise that his feet had seemed to be immobilized by invisible shackles. It made his movements suddenly turn rigid. Katie, who had recovered a little, swung open the revolver's cylinder and quickly removed the spent and unused rounds. Then, she took out a quick reloading device and stuffed 6 rounds of ammunition, including her remaining purifying bullets, into the cylinder. Harras clenched his left fist and prepared for an attack. He wanted to chain his attack with Katie's shooting, in a bid to completely finish the enemy or to expend his substitutes. At this moment, the black-armored Klein smiled. It was because the opportunity he had been waiting for had come. He knew that it would take time for the biological poison bottle to show any significant effects. And once Beyonders sensed that something was wrong, they would act accordingly, either to find the hidden enemy or to escape the toxic environment. It would be difficult to seriously damage them or even finish them. Therefore, he had 2 other reasons for using the biological poison bottle. The first reason was to weaken the enemy. The second reason was to mask some smells so that Harras and the others would attribute all the abnormal smells they detected to the poison in the air. It made them focus all their attention on this aspect. This was the most important segment of a magic show and also the key to success or failure. That abnormal smell was the smell of gas. The reason why Klein let the gas lamp and the fire in the fireplace suddenly brighten and extinguish wasn't solely to affect Harras and company's vision. It was mainly to attract their attention, so that he could destroy a few hidden gas pipes. In the beginning, he had intentionally put himself in danger in order to trick Katie into firing a bullet meant for wraiths and specters, so that she would no longer blindly fire at him and not trigger a corresponding explosion. He kept entangling himself with her and hadn't made any other attempts solely because he was waiting for the air to be filled with gas. Therefore, he kept holding back from using flaming jump or flame controlling. As for Harras's actions of using confinement on the room, he had expected it, but he didn't expect it to be this successful. Therefore, before he entered the dining room, he had kindly inspected the doors and windows to see if they were airtight. He had destroyed the hidden gas pipes in the hall, causing the area, both inside and outside, to become a huge bomb. Even without confinement, it would ultimately not affect anything. As a specter, Klein was undoubtedly unafraid of explosions. Lower-level ghosts might be annihilated by fire, but specters would at most suffer some damage. This was why Klein had to buy extra purifying bullets and the sun brooch despite the fact that he had flame controlling. When he saw that Katie had raised her revolver and was about to shoot, and that Harras was about to pronounce death on him, Klein smiled and snapped his fingers. Harras suddenly felt a dangerous foreboding. However, at this moment, he saw that a flame had already lit up in the fireplace to his side, instantly igniting the surrounding air. Boom! With a loud boom, Harras's vision was instantly filled with an inferno that filled the room. It was as if he was watching a grand display of fireworks. Chapter 380, Curtain Call. Capim lay flat on the ground, itching and aching, wishing he could tear himself apart on the spot to rid himself of this hellish pain. Then, he saw a scarlet wave of fire that spread over in a flash, and he heard a deafening explosion. He imagined that this last moment would seem infinitely long and that it would allow him to recall all of the beautiful scenes when his wife and children were still by his side. He thought that he would feel relieved because he would no longer have to endure this inhuman torture, but at that moment, extreme fear and an intense desire to live surged from the bottom of his heart. And the so-called memories didn't even flash past his mind before he was overwhelmed by an excruciating pain before being plunged into deep darkness. Boom! The dining room windows were blasted apart, accompanied by countless brick fragments and rubble, as well as the burning tongues of fire that kept reaching outwards. The guards patrolling this area were immediately knocked over. Those who were lucky enough to not get hit had their ears left ringing. Their bodies either swayed, staggered, or fell. They saw that more than half of the dining room's outer wall had collapsed and that the flames seemed to be floating in midair. The residents of the entire street and the police officers in charge of the surrounding area heard a loud boom at the same time, leaving them confused and frightened. In the dining room, dressed in black armor and a black crown, Klein stood there, bathing in the red flames and enjoying the strong blasts of the waves without flinching. A lot of the black gases around him had dispersed, and even his spirit body had suffered some damage, but it wasn't serious at all. Beside a toppled table, Parker and Capim were blasted into a corner, their heads were cracking and their bodies charred. The surface of their bodies was still quietly burning with flames, and the rest of the servants were in a similar state. In the area opposite the fireplace, Katie, who had been unable to avoid the attack in time, was slammed into the wall and then fell to the ground. Her body was mangled and covered in blood, and there were a lot of charred marks on her skin. Not a single piece of her skin remained intact. She wasn't dead yet, but she had fainted from her severe injuries. Even so, she still coughed while convulsing, inhaling large amounts of the lingering flames. The black whip also suffered similar damage. Many cracks appeared on its surface, and a small portion of the whip was ignited. None of the Beyonder bullets that she possessed were spared from the explosion. Katie was no longer capable of fighting. Harras had rolled in time to protect his vitals, but there was still a lot of blood and charred flesh on him. He staggered to his feet, revealing that his back, his hairband, and his legs were ablaze with red flames. His breathing became more difficult, and his body suffered relatively severe injuries. However, this was sufficient to prove the robustness and strength of his body. Or rather, having worn the black iron glove, his body became sufficiently robust, and his physique was sufficiently strong. However, this was within Klein's expectations. Since he was unable to assess how much damage his opponent could take, he had overestimated his enemy's constitution while coming up with a plan. Out of the corner of his eye, Harras saw that Klein was almost perfectly fine. His pupils shrank as he hurriedly stretched out his left hand and pointed in that direction. He said in a low voice, "Exile." Again, Klein failed to resist and was pushed away like scrap paper in a hurricane. He flew out of the dining room. In the hall outside, after the momentary ignition, the fire had already weakened. Another wave of disaster was brewing due to the wooden staircase, but the damage here wasn't too severe because the main body of the explosion had been confined to the dining room. Seizing this opportunity, Harras suddenly turned around and ran outside without looking back. Even though the flames covering his body were still burning, he didn't waste any time to deal with them. He knew that he was in a terrible condition and on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, the effects of the poison would soon reach its peak. Compounded by these two factors, he didn't think that he had any chance of defeating the intruder. It would be the same even if he had the help of the Sequence 7, Belize, at the entrance to the basement. Harras believed that if this battle continued, the only thing that awaited him was having the poison act up or him losing control due to his injuries. Once he decided to run, he didn't care about Katie, who was still alive, anymore. When Klein, who had just stabilized his body under exile, saw this scene, he immediately raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a shriek that no human could hear. Hum! Harras felt a wave of dizziness, and his feet paused for a moment. His skin, which was still in relatively good condition, was now covered in dense, translucent blisters. This was an early sign of him losing control. However, he quickly recovered and continued his mad dash, escaping from the lawn of the villa. He's really hard to kill. Klein didn't pursue him, in order to avoid an accident. He remembered that his goal was to rescue the victims and not to wipe away these degenerate Beyonders. More importantly, he had expended a lot of his energy and had suffered heavy injuries. If he were to give chase, he might not be able to stop Harras's berserk counterattack. Pa! Klein snapped his fingers and fired an air bullet. The bullet struck Katie in the head, ending her pain. Immediately following that, Klein turned around and flew towards the entrance to the basement. Belize, who had a full beard, had been keeping an eye on the situation outside, but he didn't dare to leave his post out of fear that the intruder's accomplices would take the opportunity to break into the dungeon. At this very moment, he held a high-pressure steam rifle and had his spirit vision activated. He had been frightened by the loud boom and became abnormally tense. Immediately afterwards, he saw the dignified spectre fly over, and without hesitation, he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. Bang! White mist was ejected from the barrel, and a sharp-tipped pale gold bullet was shot forward at an astonishing speed. Klein was prepared and long had a hunch. He had drawn out a small curve before Belize fired. The bullet tore through the hall, past the front door, and to the outside. At the same time, Belize rushed out of the duty room, holding his high-pressure steam rifle, and took on a threatening pose as he quickly moved towards the door. He believed that the intruder, who could deal with Harras, Katie, and Parker, would be able to easily kill him as well. Besides, such a big commotion must have attracted a lot of attention. He couldn't be certain that the mandated punishers would come over to investigate. Therefore, his only choice was to flee. Klein once again let out an invisible shriek, making Belize feel as if he had been smashed by a hammer. He saw stars as a few drops of blood dripped from the tip of his nose. But this didn't stop Belize from running. After shooting at Klein to stop him, he was already running into the hall, tumbling towards the door. Klein hesitated for a moment, then he gave up on chasing and fighting. He turned off the main valve, went to the entrance of the basement, and snapped his fingers repeatedly. Bang! 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 Air bullets shot at the invisible walls, gradually disintegrating the confinement. This was also one of the reasons why Klein dared to cause a gas explosion and use the biological poison bottle. With the effects of Harras's confinement in the underground dungeon, as long as it wasn't a frontal assault, he didn't have to worry about accidentally harming those pitiful girls. He destroyed the locks and flew into the dungeon, first finding the cell where Daisy had been held based on the revelation from his prior divination scenes. He then confirmed that she wasn't hurt too badly and was still able to move. Then, his body turned illusory and melted into the metal door. Creak! 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 The iron doors on one side opened quickly, one after another, as though an invisible spectre was running to unlock them. Creak! 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 After one side was done, he did it for the other side. Daisy and the other girls were frightened by the explosion outside. After a while, she was surprised to find that the door to her cell was open for some baffling reason. Yet, no one entered. It felt like she could leave at any time. Some of the girls, who hadn't been disciplined at all since they were recently kidnapped, mustered their courage, got up, and attempted to run to the exit of the basement. They passed through the hall, which was slightly damaged by the explosion, and they left the burning villa's worsening condition, running faster and faster in the direction of freedom. When they reached the street, Daisy and the other girls thought to look back. Looking back, they could just barely make out an imposing figure standing upright on top of the evil building. It was clad in full black armor, and it wore a black crown. Whoosh! The cape behind the figure began to flutter silently. As they remembered the scene, they sought a nearby cathedral with their mistrust towards the police. When Klein returned to the smoky and burning dining room, he found that Parker's and Katie's Beyonder characteristics had just begun to show signs of appearing. He checked the items they were carrying and confirmed that most of them had been destroyed. Even their money was charred to a crisp. Klein jumped up to the second and third floor, quickly checking for any relevant clues. He didn't attempt to use mediumship, because he was short on time. And bringing them above the gray fog didn't meet the requirements of his curtain call. If even a minor leader was made to maintain secrecy, then these important figures would definitely have their own restrictions. They aren't good candidates for performing mediumship as I please. Furthermore, the previous series of required actions is too troublesome, complicated, and inappropriate for the current situation that I'm in. Klein ended his investigation with nothing to show for, but he picked up a deck of tarot cards. Returning to the destroyed, charred dining room, he took out all the major arcana cards from the tarot card deck and walked over to Capim's corpse. Then, he specially took 2 of them and scattered the rest over Capim's body. When this was done, he covered Capim's eyes with the 2 tarot cards he had specially drawn. They were face up with their main side. By this time, Parker's and Katie's Beyonder characteristics had appeared. Tens of seconds later, an illusory door covered with complicated symbols appeared in midair outside the villa. The door opened without a sound, and from it, a handsome man in a crisp suit walked out. He looked to be in his 40s, mature and elegant. He had a pair of golden eyes, and with just one sweep of his face, he locked onto the dining room in the midst of the fire. At this moment, a strong gust of wind blew past, and a figure flew over at high speeds. It was an old man wearing a soft hat. His silver eyes had an abnormal seriousness to them. He was wearing a black robe with the symbol of the Lord of Storms embroidered on it. It was none other than the Cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms, the Archbishop of Backlund, Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake. "Why are you here?" Ace asked in a deep voice. Any Beyonder-related matters in Sherwood Borough came under the jurisdiction of the Holy Wind Cathedral, so he was entitled to ask. The handsome man's expression turned slightly nasty as he replied, "I live nearby." They were close to the West Borough. The 2 of them didn't speak any further. They landed on the ground at the same time and entered the explosion site. A violent hurricane churned and swept away the flames, sending them to the artificial fountain outside. The wind seemed to have a life and intelligence of its own. The 2 demigod figures then saw Katie, whose head was shot and her flesh charred black, and Parker, who was entangled with someone else while his head had caved in and cracked. They also saw Capim, who was covered in tarot cards, as well as the 2 major arcana cards on the face of the human trafficker. These were the Judgment card, which depicted an angel blowing a great trumpet, and the Emperor card, which was decked out in armor and was crowned. Almost at the same time, Cardinal Snake and the handsome man sensed something and turned their heads to look outside. They discovered a majestic figure in black armor and a black crown located at the top of the house by the side of the villa. The figure nodded slightly, and his cape was lifted. Then, without any warning, he disappeared, right under the noses of the 2 high-sequence Beyonders. Chapter 381, Conjectures. With a crackle, branched lightning lit up the early winter night with a silvery white flash. It didn't smite the ground, but instead, it tore through the air, illuminating the spot where Klein stood, as if it was daytime, making him stand out. Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake, retracted his gaze. His face was gloomy as he whispered, "Rose School of Thought? It's not a wraith, nor is it an undead creature." The mature middle-aged man with a pair of golden eyes turned his head to the side to look at Capim's corpse and said, covering the target's corpse with tarot cards, "This is the second time something like this has happened in the past 2 months. When was the first instance?" Cardinal Snake asked in a deep voice. The mature middle-aged man in the well-ironed formal suit coughed lightly and said, "The time when the true creator attempted to descend into this world with the help of a swindler." "Then it's not the Rose School of Thought." Cardinal Snake made a definite judgment. Although those organizations that worshipped evil gods weren't fond of anyone, they wouldn't deliberately foil the plans of their counterparts. Instead, they wished to see their counterparts succeed, waiting for them to make a mess of the situation. I think so too. Perhaps it's the appearance of a new secret organization. Their characteristic feature is to scatter tarot cards all over the target's body. The middle-aged man smiled. And the different appearance of the tarot cards implied different meanings. This corpse has 2 cards over his face. One is Judgment, and the other is the Emperor. Judgment is the motive and goal, while the Emperor is the organization's code name. Of course, this might also be a type of ritual. Cardinal Snake didn't respond as he surveyed the area. Let's see what exactly happened here. It was only at this point in time that the first batch of mandated punishers arrived at Capim's villa. Above the grey fog, having only used paper figurine substitutes thrice and not being pushed to his limits, Klein was about to use divination to confirm Daisy's safety afterward. Daisy will successfully return home. Holding the spirit pendulum in his left hand, he closed his eyes and silently chanted the sentence. After repeating it 7 times, Klein opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant turning counterclockwise, but it moved with a very slow frequency and a tiny amplitude. This means that Daisy's journey home will be quite a bumpy one but almost negligible. After interpreting the revelation, Klein was relieved of his final concerns. He then looked at the 2 items in front of him, both of which were radiating with a strong spiritual luster. One of them was a light blue, translucent hexagonal pillar. There were traces of light flashing through it, as though it was lightning that came from the depths of one's consciousness. This was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Ma'am Katie. The other belonged to Parker, who hadn't been able to play a role in the battle. His Beyonder characteristic had condensed into a ball, like a child's fist. This fist was made up of 3 colors, iron black and dark red colors intertwined with a large swath of silver. Klein didn't hesitate to conjure a pen and paper. He was ready to use these 2 Beyonder characteristics to divine the corresponding potion formulas. Before he advanced to sequence 7, because of the additional influences that had been left on the Beyonder characteristics it was almost impossible to use divination to determine the formulas. Even if this mysterious space could help him eliminate the interference and increase his divination ability to a certain extent, it still wasn't enough. Therefore, the only method Klein could use, in the past, was mediumship. After he became a magician, he was preliminarily able to determine it using the Beyonder characteristic for a divination above the grey fog. However, there was a high probability of him failing. This time, without exception, Klein had shamelessly failed. However, he also had some gains, and that was to be able to find out the corresponding sequence names of the 2 Beyonder characteristics. Parker is a sequence 8 sheriff and Katie is a sequence 7 interrogator. Aren't these from the Arbiter pathway? This pathway is controlled by the royal family, the military, and a small number of ancient aristocratic families in Lone. Any leaks of formulas and Beyonder ingredients are dealt with harshly. Could a number of the girls abducted by Capim be sent to the estate of some aristocrat? But there's no need for them to send 4 Beyonders to help Capim just to enjoy themselves. It obviously doesn't make sense. Harras is much more powerful than Katie, so perhaps he's a sequence 6 of this pathway. After wearing that glove, he might even be as strong as a sequence 5. Could it be that they're involved in some bloody heretic sacrifice, and the target they seek cannot be exposed? Apart from those on the inside of the kingdom, Fainapotter's Castilla family also possesses this Beyonder pathway, which is then transmitted to their army and intelligence system. Could this be another espionage case of some unknown nature? Klein tried to divine a few of his conjectures, but he failed again. He temporarily put this matter to the back of his mind and lightly tapped the edge of the long bronze table as he muttered to himself, "As long as I have the formula, with the corresponding supplementary ingredients, these 2 Beyonder characteristics will be able to turn a person into a sequence 8 sheriff and sequence 7 interrogator." Miss Magician's friend who's called Zio seems to be lacking the Beyonder ingredients for sheriff. I can sell Parker's Beyonder characteristic to Miss Magician through the world so that I can quickly amass the money needed for the ingredients of the faceless sequence potion. However, always doing it through the world doesn't seem rather appropriate. I deliberately left the tarot cards this time. If Miss Justice were to hear of this matter, then she would definitely believe that it was done by my adorer. I'll let Mr. Fool do the selling on his behalf. Klein quickly finalized a plan and made the sheriff and interrogator Beyonder characteristics fly to the corner and hid it among the junk pile. I wonder what the names are for the Arbiter pathways sequence 6 and 5. It seems like something that uses order and laws. Judge? Klein put away those thoughts and closed his eyes midway to carefully observe his current state. Once again, he felt his spirituality become lively as the potion stirred. He felt that his digestion of the potion had sped up. This time, he had confidence, based on his intuition, that he had concluded most of the magician rules. The remaining minutiae were good to have, but it didn't really matter if he lacked them. It didn't significantly affect his digestion process. Conjuring a fountain pen in goatskin, Klein enhanced his memory by writing, the magician's rules. 1. Never perform unprepared. 2. Challenge the impossible, even if the final outcome is nothing but an illusion. Klein believed that these were the two core tenets of the magician's rules. Grasping them would be key, and the rest were supplementary for perfection. 3. Take the initiative to perform. 4. Try to get applause from the audience. 5. Wield control of the target's attention. Putting down the dark red fountain pen, Klein skimmed through it and judged them by himself. Daily acting, together with 3 or 4 proactive acting instances would be enough to allow me to digest the magician potion before New Year's. If I were to challenge an impossible performance during this period, then my progress would be even faster. This is roughly at the speed I wish to achieve. There were still about 2 months till January 1, 1350. After doing all this, Klein rubbed his temples, prepared to return to the real world. After putting away the Dark Emperor card, the biological poison bottle, and other items, he suddenly laughed and said self-deprecatingly, "Challenge the impossible. Isn't that equivalent to courting death?" As his voice echoed, Klein's figure disappeared from the space above the gray fog. In the cheap hotel in the Backlund Bridge area, he suddenly opened his eyes and saw the candlelight of his summoning ritual. After quickly clearing up everything, Klein put on a thick worker's jacket he'd bought for 4 soldi and went to the window. He picked up the sweet iced tea that he had bought earlier and looked at his blurry figure which was reflected in the window. There was a heartfelt smile on his face as he whispered, "Cheers." Just as he finished his sentence, he touched the glass with his cup, then lifted his chin and downed it in one gulp. Then, he sauntered out of the hotel. The nearby gas lamps were already fully lit up, and pedestrians and carts were bustling about, oblivious to the explosion at the border between the Sherwood Borough and West Borough. Klein strolled around the Bravehearts bar for a while, and at 7:58, he knocked on the door of the Beyonder gathering organized by Eye of Wisdom. He wore an iron mask and a hooded robe, acting completely ordinary. Meanwhile, Zio, who went to various places every night to check on her contacts, saw a sign that had never appeared before. It belonged to the golden-masked man who had sold the sheriff's formula to her at the gathering organized by Mr. A. It was the sign of an emergency meeting. "He hasn't come looking for me all this time, and I've been pretending that it had never happened. Why would he suddenly?" Zio thought for a moment before deciding to take a look. The golden-masked man had promised to give her some missions, allowing her to save enough money and exchange it for the corresponding Beyonder ingredients. Therefore, Zio switched areas and marked the time and place of the meeting. Half an hour later, Zio walked out of her hiding place after secretly observing a remote alley that also extended in all directions. She walked towards the golden-masked man. The man was still wearing his black tuxedo. His light brown eyes swept over Zio's head. "There's a mission for you." "Difficulty and compensation?" Zio asked like clockwork. The man nudged his mask which was forged from gold. "It's not dangerous, but it can be very dangerous. It all depends on what you do. The initial compensation is 30 pounds. If you can acquire useful information, I can even directly give you a Beyonder ingredient corresponding to sheriff." "What's the mission?" Zio said with a frown. The golden-masked man's gaze turned heavy as he said, "Through the channels available to you, figure out who has recently been keeping tabs on Capim." "Capim? That human trafficker?" Zio returned with a question. The man nodded. Yes. I reject this mission. I hate him. Xiao immediately refused. The man opposite her chuckled. You aren't working for Capim. Because he's dead. Dead? Xiao was instantly stunned. He died at home, and his body was covered with tarot cards. There were 2 cards on his face, one, Judgment, and the other, the Emperor. By the way, pay attention to matters in the past few years which have involved tarot cards but were not reported to the police, the man added. Chapter 382, Hero Bandit Sherwood Borough, in the house Xiao and Furs rented. Furs was just finishing the beginning of her new book and, in her good mood, prepared to reward herself with a cigarette, when Xiao pushed open the door and entered the study. Smoking is harmful to your health. Xiao sniffed. Furs didn't argue with her when she saw her puzzled look. Instead, she asked, looks like something happened to you? Xiao scratched her rough blonde hair and sat down on a nearby chair. That person from before contacted me, the person who sold the sheriff formula to me through another person at Mr. A's gathering. He gave me a relatively simple mission. The initial reward is 30 pounds. I don't even know if there are any hidden dangers. Furs thought for a moment and then said, that person. There should be an organization behind him, but why would they want to rope you in? Aren't they afraid of being implicated by your intelligence, thus, causing the entire organization to be completely destroyed? There's nothing they really need from you either. Your looks are barely passable, but you're too short, so perhaps your life is relatively more valuable. What mission is it? Xiao was used to her good friend's snide remarks as she ignored what she said in the beginning. She directly answered the second question, investigate if there has been anyone keeping tabs on Capim recently. Capim? The human trafficker who deserves to be hanged, no, burned to death. Although Furs wasn't a bounty hunter, it was her writer's instinct to gather material, so she often asked Xiao to tell her stories and news she had learned. Xiao nodded. It's him, but he's already dead. He seems to have died rather miserably. How did he die? Was he sliced to death by a knife, bit by bit? Furs asked, pleased and curious. That person didn't go into a detailed description. Perhaps it'll be mentioned in the papers tomorrow. Xiao thought for 2 seconds before continuing. He only mentioned a rather special situation at the scene of the death. He said that Capim's corpse was covered in tarot cards. His face was covered with the Judgment and the Emperor cards. The Judgment card probably meant that it was a judgment on Capim, and the verdict was death. But what does the Emperor card represent? That murderer, no, that hero's identity? As a best-selling author, Furs instinctively began interpreting the unique layout of the scene of the crime. Suddenly, she froze. Tarot cards? The corpse was strewn with tarot cards? Furs suddenly thought of the secret organization she had just joined, Tarot Club. It couldn't be one of us, could it? However, none of the members has the code name of the Emperor. If it's really the case, then this is the first time I've found traces of the Tarot Club in the real world. We're not just a secret organization that only exists above the gray fog. As Furs's emotions churned, she felt pleasantly surprised and also worried. Under an attendant's lead, Klein entered the familiar activity room. There was only one candle in the room. The dim yellow light made the surroundings look like a scene from a ghost story. Coupled with the black robes and the iron masks worn by the mysterious people, the atmosphere turned even more intense. The moment he stepped in, Klein suddenly had a baffling sensation. He felt the flickering candle flame staring at him. He felt that the flame would burst and ignite his hair and robe. He felt that the curtain behind the oriel window would suddenly flare up, enveloping his body, and covering his nose and mouth, forcefully choking him to death. What's happening? Klein was stunned as he turned extremely tense. It wasn't a premonition for danger, but a feeling that was hard to avoid. Klein carefully found a seat and sat down. The moment his buttocks touched the surface of the chair, he felt as if the chair would explode and thick wooden thorns would end up piercing through his body. This reminded him of the videos he had seen back on Earth. Due to the explosion of a low-quality gas cylinder under a swivel chair, the steel pole, and the debris had stabbed into the seated owner's buttocks, drilling into his abdomen. The whole scene was filled with badly mutilated blood and flesh, a ghastly sight. Why am I always making such bad associations? Is it because of the damage done to my spirit body from the battle earlier? Klein looked around thoughtfully and saw that the fat apothecary had still not attended. What happened? Or has he already left Backland? Klein murmured something to himself and heard Eye of Wisdom announce the beginning of the gathering. In the course of the next few hours, Klein felt as if the chandelier on the ceiling was going to fall sideways and smash into his head. He thought that the coffee table in front of Eye of Wisdom would suddenly move sideways and stumble him over, and he suspected that the members of the gathering around him were full of malice and might cause him trouble at any moment. It made him fidgety, alert, and puzzled, and he was too distracted to pay attention to deals that either ended in success or failure. If one is to say that a premonition for danger is like an occasional vibration, reminding one that there's news entering the room or an incoming phone call, then the feeling I have at this moment is akin to an electric drill boring constantly, causing me to be unable to relax or pay attention to anything else. Klein tried to rub his forehead, but it only touched the cold iron mask. At this moment, he felt as if his iron mask would suddenly cave in and stick close to his face, embedding itself into his brain. Is it really because my spirit body was damaged so it's making me hallucinate? Klein frowned. He originally wanted to make a request to buy the thousand-faced hunter's blood and mutated pituitary gland at this meeting, but in such a situation, he could only give up out of caution. Although the level of Eye of Wisdom's gathering wasn't high, and there was a high probability that it wouldn't involve a high-level monster like the thousand-faced hunter, Klein believed that a lot of the members here also attended other gatherings and might be able to come into contact with the relevant information and clues. Amidst his anxiety, Klein attended the gathering as a bystander. Just after taking off his robe, removing his mask, and leaving the room, the feeling that everything in the room was going to harm him had instantly disappeared, disappearing in the oddest manner. This. Klein's pupils shrank, confirming that his previous experiences didn't originate from the damage to his spirit body, otherwise, he wouldn't have experienced two completely different states, inside and outside. He suspected that there was a person or creature in the activity room of the gathering, one that was invisible, imperceptible, and extremely terrifying. That entity had stimulated his spiritual perception as a seer and his sense of danger as a clown, but because of the entity's suppression or some other special reason, this stimulus appeared in the form of a rich association that failed to make him realize it. Who could it be? This is too scary. Just the existence itself made me have a reaction similar to the symptoms of losing control. Without making a sound, Klein left Eye of Wisdom's house and headed toward the nearest street. All of a sudden, he had a guess. The Bravehearts bar is nearby, and it's also the monitoring area of Wraith Steve, who was killed by Miss Sharon, Marek, and I. Their deaths would definitely make the Rose School of Thought's high-sequence Beyonder angry, and he would cast his sights over here, towards the Beyonders living near the Bravehearts bar. Was that him? Fortunately, I used the biological poison bottle and the sun brooch tonight, and to prevent myself from being divined, I left them above the grey fog. Otherwise, the result would be unimaginable. The magician who just completed an impossible performance would be killed directly here. The Beyonder world is truly dangerous. Inside the Holy Wind Cathedral, Cardinal Ace Snake looked at the captain of the mandated Punisher team and asked emotionlessly, "Who is Capim? Why is there an underground dungeon in his villa?" The captain of the mandated Punisher team replied immediately, "He's a tycoon, one who was rumored to be related to many cases of missing girls. He's suspected of being a human trafficker, and that he is secretly engaged in the slave trade." That underground dungeon proves the rumors. Why did a human trafficker receive the protection of so many Beyonders? And their sequences aren't low either, Cardinal Snake pressed. Your Grace, this requires an investigation. We tried using Beyonder means to find clues, but all of them failed, the captain of the mandated Punisher team replied, somewhat trembling in fear. I've tried it too, Cardinal Snake didn't blame him. This member of the Church of the Lord of Storm's upper echelon paused for a moment before continue to investigate this matter. Also, find that sequence 6 or 5 Spectre. After his subordinate had left, Cardinal Snake picked up his fountain pen and wrote down in his notebook a number of subjects to pay close attention to: Capim, human trafficking, tarot card ritual, strange spectre without a high sequence, concealed plot. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. Audrey was waiting for the maid to cut up the food, when she heard her father, Count Hall, who was used to reading the newspapers at breakfast, laugh. Capim is dead. Who is he? Audrey asked with her eyes wide open. In fact, she wasn't the least bit curious about who Capim was. She was simply going along with her father, who obviously had the desire to share his thoughts. This was both her specialty as a daughter and the innate nature of a telepathist. He's a tycoon who secretly might be a human trafficker. He has rather good ties with some people. Heh, Count Hall chuckled. He was killed last night. There were obvious signs of him being judged at the scene of the crime, so the newspapers are calling the murderer a hero bandit. The hero bandit Dark Emperor. Oh, they named him after the code name of the rulers of the ancient Solomon Empire. Hero bandit? Hero bandit Dark Emperor? Dark Emperor. Audrey immediately thought of the card of blasphemy belonging to Mr. Fool. This was the item of the highest level she had come into contact with so far. She suddenly became interested in the Capim murder. It sounds interesting. Although it's illegal, I still want to say that the hero bandit did beautifully. Oh, Dad, how did it go? The police and relevant departments of the church didn't divulge any exact details. I haven't met them either, but this is what's said on the papers. The hero bandit was dressed in black armor and a black crown. He had a cape of the same color behind him. After he entered Capim's villa, not only did he steal all the valuables in the safe, but he even stole the lives of Capim and his evil henchmen, rescuing girls who were locked up in the underground dungeon. He scattered tarot cards on Capim's body, and the most prominent of all were the 2 cards that covered his face. One of them was Judgment and the other was the Emperor. Count Hall held the newspaper as he described it with a smile. Tarot cards, Judgment card and the Emperor card. Audrey's eyes suddenly lit up. Chapter 383, Returning home. Audrey could almost be certain that it had been done by Mr. Fool's adorer when she heard the description of the familiar scene. She suddenly felt a strong sense of immersion, participation, and pride. That was a human trafficker whose hands were stained with blood and evil. The Judgment card is the retribution enacted against him in the name of justice. Was the verdict hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake? The Emperor should be a symbol of his identity. Was this the adorer who sneaked into the Royal Museum and stole the Dark Emperor card? Audrey let her imagination run wild for a moment. She had intended to press for more information and finer details, but from the look on her father's face, the tone of his voice, and the color of his emotions, she could tell that he still didn't know what was going on. Therefore, she could only suppress her curiosity and planned on asking her good friend, Kance Learson, from MI9. Although directly asking Kance about it would suit my image in this aspect, that would still be rather abrupt. It would also conflict with my identity as a noble. I'll get Annie to prepare a few invitations for an afternoon tea party, sending them separately to Glaint, Kance, Murray, Christine, Jane, and the others. Most of them are interested in mysticism, so they would feel interested in someone known as the hero bandit Dark Emperor. Under my guidance, they can help me ask a lot of questions that wouldn't be convenient for me to ask. It's decided. Audrey retracted her attention and nibbled at her breakfast. She believed that Mr. Fool's adorers wouldn't have dealt with Capim purely for the sake of punishing evil, since it wasn't in line with his identity and status. Of course, if Audrey was still the same Audrey who had just joined the Tarot Club a few months ago, then she definitely would have been willing to accept such an explanation, otherwise, she wouldn't have chosen the Justice card as her symbol. After experiencing so many gatherings and so many matters, she felt that she had matured a lot and was no longer as innocent. She believed that there had to be more important and essential factors behind this matter, such as an evil god or secret organization which Capim was involved in. I hope Kantz can provide some useful information, Audrey thought with anticipation. 15 Minsk Street. Klein was eating white bread with jam and flipping through today's newspapers. What? A safe? As he read, he almost choked on his own saliva. It wasn't me. I didn't. Don't spout nonsense. In his mind, Klein immediately rejected the description of his theft of everything in the safe thrice. The situation had been pressing, and in order to gain clues, all he did was burrow into the safe to see if there were any important documents or evidence despite having found the safe. He didn't take anything, and he quickly left the safe and went to another room. Of course, Klein, in his spirit-body state, had also suffered some damage from the gas explosion, and the total weight of the items he could carry had been greatly reduced. There were only gold bars, jewelry, land deeds, house deeds, antiques, and other items in the safe, which were either not convenient for him to take, or there was no way he could launder them. Perhaps he has a place reserved especially for cash, but unfortunately, I didn't find it, nor did I have the time to look for it. Klein muttered silently to himself, confirming that it was the subsequent investigators who had divided up all the contents in the safe. He looked at the newspaper, took a sip of Side black tea, and slowly exhaled. He smiled inwardly. Hero Bandit Dark Emperor. I like that name. After breakfast, Klein put on his thick double-breasted frock coat and half-top hat, and he held a solid black cane. Opening the door, he left Minsk Street for Broken Axe Lane on the boundary of the East Borough. That was where Daisy had disappeared. After finalizing his plans yesterday, and before he committed to his operation, he had deliberately made a trip to Broken Axe Lane to seriously look for clues. He knocked on the doors of the nearby houses and asked if they had seen any girls like Daisy. Although Klein didn't believe that the official Beyonders would think that a poor family would be able to afford a hero bandit who had at least the strength of a Sequence 6, and he believed that there was a higher probability that the investigation would be directed towards the secrets Capim was involved in, supplemented by, who had been keeping tabs on Capim recently, and other peripheral investigations. He still cautiously decided to put on a show and try his best to play out the entire act. What if one of the Beyonder enforcers lost their mind and planned to make a preliminary investigation in this aspect? Some families might have some savings and would be able to hire other detectives. The chances of being suspected as a kind-hearted person like me who just took on the case yesterday are extremely low. As long as I'm not suspected, they wouldn't compare my performance from the previous Lenivas case. Besides, the Nighthawks were the ones who took action previously and were assisted by the military's special department. Capim's case happened in Sherwood Borough, so the ones taking on the case would likely be the mandated punishers. The communication between the two groups wouldn't be that smooth. Katie and Parker belong to the Arbiter pathway. I wonder if the military will intervene. As a former Nighthawk, Klein had a sufficient understanding of the modus operandi of the various official organizations, their work styles, and their investigation habits. Simply put, I have excellent anti-detective abilities. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he boarded a carriage. He was going to continue his investigation into Daisy's disappearance. After all, he was an ordinary private detective who hadn't been able to confirm that Daisy's disappearance had anything to do with Capim. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Daisy returned to the shabby rented apartment under the escort of the police officer in charge of the neighborhood. Along with a few pitiful girls like her, she had been settled into the various cathedrals in Sherwood Borough last night and had been questioned accordingly. It included what they saw when they escaped, what they saw when they looked back, where they lived, what their family situation was, if they knew any friends who were out of the ordinary, and so on and so forth. Daisy, who was still in a state of panic and lingering fear, answered the questions truthfully. After that, no one came to her again. She slept through the night and was sent back to Eastborough early in the morning, where she was handed over to the fierce police officer she always saw. Along the way, Daisy didn't dare to say anything. She trembled in fear, and only when she entered the apartment where she lived did she feel a little more at ease. As soon as she stepped through the door, and before she could find her mother and sister through the hanging wet clothes, she heard a scream. "Daisy!" Freyja stopped whatever she was doing and, like a nimble fawn, darted through the clothes hanging in the air and the random things on the ground. She ran to the door and hugged her sister tightly. Then she let go of her hand, and with tears streaming down her cheeks, she sized Daisy up with pleasant surprise and in concern. "Are you all right? It's so wonderful that you're finally back." Liv also stood up from behind the wash basin. She wiped her hands on her clothes and asked, rubbing her eyes, "Daisy, where have you been these past few days?" At that moment, the police officer interrupted. "She was kidnapped. We rescued her." Thank you. You guys are too great." Liv shed tears and randomly used an adjective. The policeman coughed lightly and said, "That's our duty." "Have you met anyone strange in the past few days?" Liv was stunned for a second. Hoping to not be involved in too many matters or get into any trouble, she said, "No, I really haven't." The policeman waved his hand and said, "Be more careful in the future. Don't take deserted shortcuts again." He couldn't stand the humidity and the motley of smells, so he turned and left. Liv looked at her daughter again. She took wide strides over to her side and wiped her hands on the side of her clothes before hugging Daisy. "It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back," she murmured through her tears, not asking if Daisy had been hurt. Daisy relaxed and sobbed. Beside her, Freyja was also crying. She stretched out her arms and hugged her mother and sister respectively. The three of them cried for a while before letting go. Liv wiped her eyes again and said, "Wash the clothes first, there are still a lot of them." Daisy, who had just been rescued, nodded and quickly threw herself into her busy work. It wasn't until noon, while they were nibbling on their black bread and drinking plain water that could hardly even be considered tea, that Liv finally had time to ask, "Daisy, were you hurt?" Daisy shook her head. "They just hit me a few times." "That's great. The police rescued you? A kind detective was willing to help search for you for free yesterday, and you ended up returning today." "Ah, he still has your vocabulary book," Freyja mentioned in passing. "Already prepared," Liv mentioned. "I'll get old Kohler to get it back and tell the detective you're home so that he won't have to busy himself over this matter. Regardless, we have to thank him again." Daisy felt relieved as she replied to her sister's question, "No, it wasn't the police. There was a sudden explosion, and the doors that kept us locked up were strangely opened, and we just ran out. However, I did see a gentleman or a lady on the roof. He wore black armor, a crown-like helmet, and a cape. He just stood there watching us quietly. None of those bad guys came to stop us or chase us down." As a tutor at the free school, Daisy clearly had a richer set of vocabulary than her mother, Liv. "A person dressed like that saved you?" Liv answered in shock. By the side, Freyja curiously waited for the answer. Daisy nodded seriously and said, "Yes, he's like what the bards sing of. A hero." Hero. Freyja ruminated over the word, her eyes as bright as the stars. In a certain secret chamber, a group of people were carefully comparing the Uniqueness case with the Capim case using the information they were given as they searched for similarities between the motives and modus operandi. The two things cannot be linked together at all. The only thing that they have in common is evil, or rather, evil was defeated. The owner of the tarot card has upheld justice, someone exclaimed. It can be confirmed that the two cases didn't involve the same person. The difference in strength is obvious, and what they're good at is even more contrasting. Although it's possible that their sequence had been elevated, Capim's murderer was a kind of specter, or someone that can switch into the sequence state. That's not something common. Another person's analysis was endorsed by the majority. Therefore, the person who called the meeting concluded, two cases, two different people, but they both threw out tarot cards. Perhaps the latter was committing a copycat crime, and if that's the case, we can target the people who are aware of the Uniqueness case. The other possibility is that there is an organization. An organization symbolized by tarot cards. Chapter 384, On Your Own You Check Yourself in Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. The aroma of Faina Potter's top-quality Mount Saint Dercy coffee blended with the splendid fragrance of the Queen's black tea to create an intoxicating symphony of smells. They lingered around the elegant three-tiered high tea tray, that served delicious and delicate desserts. This was the high tea party organized by Audrey. She had invited her friends of blue blood parentage, all who were fellow enthusiasts in mysticism. They sat around her, talking and laughing. Under Audrey's imperceptible guidance, Jane, Murray, and the others became extremely interested in the Dark Emperor, the hero bandit who had appeared last night. All of them cast their eyes towards the noble-born Kanclerson who had joined MI9. What beyonder powers does that Dark Emperor have? The sweet-looking Christine asked curiously. Among the few of them, the lowest rank among their fathers was that of a viscount. It allowed them to have sufficient status and channels to understand the existence of beyonder powers and potions in their endearing pursuit of mysticism. But just like Audrey before, they were all unwilling to join the Nighthawks, the mandated Punishers, the Machinery Hive Mind, and MI9. Other than that, the families that they belonged to didn't have histories that traced back to 1,000 years ago, and even the ancient aristocrats that had just been established in the fourth epoch of the Lone Kingdom weren't completely loyal to the royal family or to the upper echelons of the military. They weren't bestowed with any formulas, and even if they had beyonder ingredients, it was unlikely that they could recognize them. They wouldn't even know how to use them even if they did recognize them. This limited the possibility of Murray, Christine, and the others in becoming beyonders. They could only look forward to it, but it was difficult for them to take that crucial step. As for whether or not their elders had collected the potion formulas and nurtured beyonders for their families, that was beyond their purview. After all, this wasn't allowed. If the king were to find out, they could use this as a reason to strip them of their noble titles. Of course, there were already two traitors in the living room, Audrey, who had advanced to Sequence 8 telepathist, and Viscount Glaint, who had gathered one portion of beyonder ingredients. It wouldn't be long before he became an apothecary. The tall, thin, young gentleman, Kantz, took a sip of his coffee and said, "I won't give you a direct answer. I'll just tell you some facts. Other than traces of a gas explosion in the dining room where the battle happened, various means were used to detect poison, substitutes, Spectre's shriek, bullets condensed with holy powers, and other elements. By the way, that Dark Emperor, no, hero bandit was in a Spectre state. It doesn't look like the person who had killed Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, nor does it look like the person who had dealt with Uniqueness in the sewers. Is the person involved in Capim's case Mr. Fool's third adorer who stole the Dark Emperor's card? There are at least 3 adorers in Backland alone. How many adorers does he have in total?" Audrey's heart skipped a beat as she deliberately asked, "Was there an intense beyonder battle?" Murray, under her lead, asked one step further, "There were beyonders at Capim's place? Relatively powerful beyonders? And there was more than one?" He's just a trafficker, Viscount Glaint unconsciously expressed his doubt. Audrey maintained her faint smile and curious gaze, patiently waiting for Kant's reply. Kant laughed and said, Murray's guess is correct. I can only say this much. Do you want me to be locked up by Captain? Capim's place had more than one relatively powerful beyonder. Indeed, he's not an ordinary human trafficker. He might be involved in many matters regarding mysticism. Human trafficker. Could he be involved in some cult sacrificial rite? Mr. Fool's adorer attacked because of this? It was roughly the same with Lenivus. It involved a cult and sacrifices, as well as the descent of the true creator. I wonder which cult and evil god is behind Capim. Mr. Fool's goal seems to have always been targeting these evil gods. Is it really strife between the gods? Who knows how many grand schemes of those evil gods he has foiled? Audrey made many connections as her heart surged with emotions. Our tarot club's enemies are the evil gods. The rest aren't qualified. Does Mr. Fool wish to get the title of the nemesis of evil gods? Audrey pursed her lips and chuckled softly in her heart. Then, she suppressed her emotions and secretly made a confession. Audrey, how can you do this? How can you use Mr. Fool as a joke? At noon, when Klein returned to Minsk Street, he found, as he had expected, a letter from old Kohler who had paid a carriage driver to deliver to his mailbox. This was their agreed-upon contact method during an emergency. Of course, according to Klein's prediction, old Kohler, who didn't know many words, could only use simple symbols to tell him where and when they would meet. To his surprise, it was actually written in neat writing when he opened the letter. With a quick glance, Klein confirmed that it was identical to the handwriting in Daisy's vocabulary book. Looks like this girl was the one who helped old Kohler write it. This piece of paper doesn't seem to be exposed to moisture. Perhaps old Kohler had bought some in the event he needs to contact me urgently. Klein opened the door to the living room and read the letter. Only taking off his hat and cane, he leaned his cane against the wall. He didn't take off his coat because the fireplace in the room wasn't lit yet, and the early November cold was silently seeping into his bones. The letter was simple. After all, Daisy didn't know many words either. She thanked the detective for his kindness and good intentions before telling him that she safely returned home, and she finally said, in a tactful way, that she hoped he would bring her vocabulary book with him the next time he came to Eastborough. What a polite girl. Klein chuckled. He snapped his fingers and burned the letter, leaving no clues behind. He decided to return to Eastborough the next day and return the book to Daisy, as well as reimburse old Kohler for the cost of the letter delivery letters, paper, and fountain pens. With this in mind, he couldn't help but sigh and chortle. Captain, now it's my turn to approve the expense claims of others. Without wasting any time, he went out again and went straight to the Quelag Club, where Dr. Aaron was seen more often during Friday afternoons. Klein wanted to ask about Wuxia, the child who had played with tarot cards. After entering the Quelag Club in Hillston Borough, Klein said to the red-vested attendant, "A cup of Marquis black tea and a serving of dessert. Send it to the corner seat of the main hall. Dr. Aaron, reporter Mike, and the others are sitting there." Klein had already spotted the relatively cold and famous surgeon, Aaron Series, who was wearing gold-rimmed glasses, as well as reporter Mike Joseph from the Daily Observer, who he had worked with twice and had a pair of charming blue eyes. He also saw the aristocratic equestrian teacher, Talem Dumont, whose frequency of appearing at the club was only second to his. "Oh, our great detective is here, and we happen to be talking about you." Talem stood up with a smile. "Speaking bad things behind my back?" Klein joked. Mike stood up and shook his hand. "No, I want to hire you again." "What's the matter this time?" Klein bowed at Dr. Aaron and sat down at their table. Mike chuckled and said, "I'm sure you've read the papers. Capim has been killed off by the hero Bandit Dark Emperor, and his crimes have been exposed. What a joyous event. And as a reporter, I need to have an acumen for the news. I plan to get a list of names of the girls who were rescued in East Borough from the police department to interview them. Then, I'll paint Capim's most cruel, most evil, and most unforgivable side to the readers of the newspaper. Of course, the victims must remain anonymous. He paused for a moment and suppressed his voice. I also have a hidden objective, or should I say, I wish to use the interview to know if these girls or their family know any relatively special friends. Who knows, that might be Hero Bandit Dark Emperor. You found the right person. The corners of Klein's mouth almost twitched. He smiled at Mike and said, "We've already worked together on East Borough's matters. We have sufficient familiarity and trust, so I have no reason to decline. I hope for a pleasant partnership." Mike stretched out his hand. "We'll start tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, and will be paid the same as last time for a total of £10. At that moment, Dr. Aaron, who had been listening by the side, said, "Sherlock, I want to hire you as well. This evening, or after dinner. It looks like my business is improving recently." Klein asked, amused, "Will it conflict with Mike's request?" "No." Aaron shook his head. "My luck recently has been pretty good. This makes me suspect that my bout of bad luck was because of that child's inverted wheel of fortune card and the words he said. I'm very troubled and puzzled in this regard. I swear to God that I was very nice to him, and I treated him with the best of intentions. Why would he treat me that way? I wished to visit him at his place and confirm that he didn't do it on purpose. However, I'm ultimately afraid that something similar would happen again or some accident might occur. Therefore, I wish to hire you to protect me. Just for tonight. It won't conflict with Mike's request. How about it? That's what I wanted to do. After challenging the impossible and doing good deeds, my moral standing has become pretty good. Am I really going to become the king of yellow and black who wields good luck?" Klein was pleasantly surprised as he said with a reserved smile, "No problem, we can talk about the remuneration." City of Silver. Derek Berg once again examined the translucent worm with 12 circles, the remains of Amon's avatar. He had originally wanted to ask Mr. Fool what this was exactly, but considering how he had already troubled this godlike figure once, he couldn't bring himself to ask as he abandoned this plan. Now, he planned on showing it at the next tarot gathering and ask Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and the rest. After hiding the worm, Derek suddenly thought of something. It was about time for the team that had gone with Shepherd Elder Lovia, to explore the half-destroyed temple of the fallen creator, to return. It wasn't too far from the City of Silver, and it was in a direction that they hadn't set foot in before. He decided to take a look. There were quite a few people he knew among the expedition team. Chapter 385, a story about love. Looking at the dark sky being lit up by streaks of lightning, Derek didn't knock on the doors of the few acquaintances he knew. Instead, he walked along the broadest road and walked all the way to the training field at the edge of the City of Silver. After each exploration team returned, they were forced to stay here for a certain period of time. Not only would it be convenient for them to communicate and report on the things they encountered in the darkness, but they would also be quarantined in a tactful manner to guard against strange things that might latch onto any member's body and suddenly erupt after a certain amount of time. This was the result of the City of Silver's 2,000 years of experience. It wasn't that complicated, but it was quite useful. As soon as he entered the training ground with the axe of Hurricane stuffed behind his waist, Derek Berg's eyes suddenly lit up. He saw the gorgeous Elder Lovia, who seemed to be in her 30s, as well as two familiar faces that were his age. Due to the City of Silver's limited environment, its population was unable to grow any further. The number of people of a certain age group was an adequate number, and although Derek wouldn't dare say he knew all of them, he had seen a majority of them before. He was classmates and partners with some of them during general education classes and on the practice grounds. The person Derek was most familiar with on this expedition team was Dark Regents, who had once been his patrol teammate. The youngster named Dark was of medium height and was slightly chubby. He was strong, optimistic, and cheerful. His face often beamed with a friendly smile. Currently, he was a Sequence 8 gladiator of the Giant Pathway. At this moment, the two parties were separated by a translucent wall that was as hard as steel, making it impossible for them to make any effective form of contact. They had to wait until the members of the exploration team were confirmed to have no problems before they could meet directly. Derek, who had become silent and withdrawn since the death of his parents, waved to Dark. Noticing this, the gladiator turned his head to the side and looked over. "Dark, how was it? You didn't encounter any danger, did you?" Derek shouted. The material used to create the black wall in that area came from somewhere that wasn't far from the City of Silver and was called Dark Amber. It was hard as steel, but at the same time, it possessed a certain degree of transparency and had properties that made it good for transmitting sound. Derek's speech went through unobstructed. Derek imagined that Dark would definitely smile brightly and wave his arms out of habit, saying, "Take a look, I'm not injured at all, so shouldn't it be obvious that we didn't meet with any danger?" It was nothing. Hearing his voice, Dark walked a few steps closer to the wall and answered with a smile, "No, everything went smoothly." Looking at his smile without any faults, Derek suddenly felt a chill run through his body. It was just like he was camping in a ruined tower or a ruined city at night. Darkness was all around him as they accumulated into overwhelming horror. Inside the Quelag Club, Klein and Dr. Aaron agreed on the remuneration, £2. I have to say that a doctor's money sure is easy to earn. If it were me in the past, such a request would have cost at most 10 soldi. Klein, who already had the intention to take the mission, sighed in his heart. He remembered that during his time with the Nighthawks, he had heard corpse collector Fry mention that famous doctors had very high incomes. At the time, in a response that was unlike the poet, Leonard Mitchell, he said that as far as he knew, if a house was bought in a busy borough in Backland for a storefront, the quickest option would be to turn it into a clinic. They agreed to call on Will Septon's place after dinner. It wasn't 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so the equestrian teacher, Talim, gathered the three of them together at a table, and they began playing a game of Upgrade, the game which was invented by Emperor Roselle. What I expected was to play tennis, practice shooting, flip through the books in the library, and live a healthy life. But why did it become like this? Klein spontaneously thought in between the card game. Frankly, with his current accomplishments in magic, he could have easily cleared out all the money Dr. Aaron, Reporter Mike, and Talim had on them. But I'm an honest man, and I believe more in my skills and luck. As the red-vested attendant shuffled the cards, Klein picked up a cream cracker and took a savory bite. He couldn't help but marvel from the bottom of his heart, this is life. During the game, Klein noticed one thing, the equestrian teacher, Talim, was no longer in a daze or as upset as he was before. Has the matter of his friend falling in love with someone he shouldn't have been resolved? Klein thought curiously as he sipped the Marquis black tea. As a detective, he knew that this wasn't something he should ask in front of others, so he restrained himself and concentrated on his card game. By 5 o'clock, Mike Joseph had to go back to his company, so the game was suspended and Klein won 5 soldi. My luck has been quite good recently. While Klein sighed with relief, he saw Dr. Aaron leave the table for the washroom. He controlled his voice and said with a low laugh, "Talim, has your friend's problem been settled?" Talim, who was throwing the cards in his hands onto the table, paused for a second before sighing with a smile. "You could say so." He added with a certain desire to continue, "Actually, it wasn't too serious. It was because I was thinking too much at the time. Simply put, it was an illustrious young gentleman who fell in love with a commoner. You should know that a man of such status has to marry a noble lady. To him, not even the daughter of a rich man can do. So that's how it is." To think that I made up all sorts of contrived and bizarre stories, such as falling in love with a man, a monster, or a person that isn't permitted because of moral principles. Klein was disappointed and said with a laugh, as far as I know, gentlemen of high society don't mind having a mistress. No, Sherlock, you don't understand. Love, do you get it? Love. That young gentleman only wants to marry that commoner woman, Talum exclaimed with a sigh. No, I don't understand, I'm just a bachelor dog. Klein opened his mouth, unable to respond. Talum sighed to himself. For the sake of that young gentleman's future, I once thought of asking you to find people with some miraculous abilities to covertly, heh. Anyways, I'm a law-abiding citizen, so it was just an idea. How was the matter resolved afterward? Klein asked with interest. Talum picked up his Highlander coffee and took a sip. The solution was much simpler than I thought. I went straight to the lady and told her of the dilemma. She sensibly expressed her willingness to leave the gentleman and asked for my help. I must say that she's truly a considerate, kind, refined, and beautiful girl. If it wasn't for the consideration of my identity, perhaps I would have knelt in front of her and kissed the back of her hand. Well, it seems like I couldn't have helped. Klein picked up the golden-rimmed white porcelain cup of black tea. As a visitor from Earth, he was completely uninterested in the task of breaking up couples. However, listening to gossip was another matter altogether. After having dinner at the Quelag Club and tasting the limited supply of Sonia lobsters, Klein and Dr. Aaron took the latter's carriage to Will Ossepton's house at 66 Dalton Street in Northborough. This was the address that Dr. Aaron had long since memorized. He didn't return to the hospital to look up the appropriate medical records, and according to Klein's conjecture, any relevant information pertaining to Will Ossepton would likely have been taken away by the Nighthawks. As a former Nighthawk, I know exactly how they do things. Klein smiled bitterly and sighed. Pulling the doorbell, the two waited for a while before they saw the door open. A maid in a black and white dress puzzledly asked, "Gentlemen, who are you looking for?" Seeing that Aaron was still as cold as usual, Klein took the initiative to speak up. "We're looking for Will Ossepton. This is his attending physician. He came back to check on his health." I don't know him. I've only been here for a few days. I'll get my master." "Please wait a moment," the maid answered blankly. While they were waiting, Aaron suddenly said, "I almost believed the reason you came up with just now. This is a basic quality of being a detective." Klein chuckled. At that moment, an old gentleman in his 50s walked to the door and said with a deep voice, "Will Ossepton and his family have already moved away on," he gave a date. Aaron did a slight count before frowning. Why would they go through the trouble to move 2 days after being discharged from the hospital after the operation? He acted like he was really on a follow-up visit. Klein was slightly puzzled and asked, "Sir, how do you know the date so clearly?" Typically speaking, subsequent tenants would only move in after a certain period of time. That old gentleman snappily replied, "Someone came to ask before, and I even went to look for the landlord just for that." "The Nighthawks?" Klein asked without much hope, "Do you know where Will Ossepton and his family moved to?" "No," the old man said tersely. "Did they leave anything behind?" Klein hesitated for a moment before continuing with his questions. "Some stuff," the old man took a deep breath and continued, "but they were all taken away by the previous group of people. Meeting colleagues truly is a helpless matter. They can always think of the things you think of ahead of time." Klein couldn't help but sigh. Seeing that there were no further clues, Klein and Aaron politely excused themselves and left 66 Dalton Street. "It seems like you'll have to wait a long time before you can resolve your doubts." Klein turned to Dr. Aaron. Aaron was silent for a few seconds, then he slowly let out a breath. "After what happened just now, I'm not so troubled anymore. I'm just a doctor, and it's good enough to mind my own affairs. I should return to do a follow-up checkup and not question the situation, what other people think, or why they're not kind. That shouldn't be something I should be concerned with. In the future, I should just try to maintain the relationship between a doctor and a patient as much as possible. It's for the best that you can think this way. Klein agreed from the bottom of his heart, then he casually asked, at the time, what was wrong with Wuxia left leg? His left calf grew a strange tumor that coincidentally formed a ring that pressed down heavily onto his blood vessels. Dr. Aaron recalled as he said, but the kid didn't look too upset, just a little scared, and we wanted to preserve the leg at first, but it was getting worse. Chapter 386, A Nightmare City of Silver. Derek Berg had no idea how he got home. All he remembered was the indescribable horror. Dark Regence's character and behavior didn't appear too different from his former self. However, it was true that there was a change to him that was unsettling. Derek was afraid that the City of Silver would be targeted by the evil god, the fallen creator, afraid that the City of Silver would be obliterated before he could become the sun, saving it from its more than 2,000-year-long curse, and give hope and sunshine to the residents here. At that moment in time, he hated himself for not being strong enough, that he was still only at sequence 8. No. I can't just watch idly. Derek suddenly stood up, and he prepared to rush to the spire and tell the other elders of the 6-member council and Chief Colin Iliad of what he had discovered. However, Derek knew that such anomalies weren't suspicious. Every time they explored the depths of the darkness, the members would have a period of intense tension lasting for days, tens of days, or even more than a month. In addition, the uninhabited desolate plains and the hopeless journey would bring about extreme depression. In addition, in order to be safe, the members of the exploration team wouldn't be allowed to release any sexual urges that had been pent up during their excursions, which caused them to act differently after every exploration. If they ended up with more than half the team ending up dead or injured, a huge change in personality wasn't a rare occurrence. The manner of handling such people could only be dealt with via the usual quarantine and treatment with almost zero exceptions. The City of Silver had the first 3 sequences of the Dragon Pathway, so there was no lack of psyche analysts. Derek rushed to the door and suddenly slowed down. He knew that this method of reporting to the 6-member council might not be effective. It would likely arouse suspicion, and there might even be the threat of being targeted by the shepherd, Elder Lovia. After pacing back and forth for more than 10 seconds, Derek gritted his teeth and pulled the door open. He felt that he had to warn the elders of the 6-member council, even if it would be a huge risk for him. For the vast majority of the residents of the City of Silver, sacrificing their lives to maintain the existence of this city and the continuation of this civilization was the belief that was ingrained into their bones. Selfish people often didn't live long in such environments regardless of whether it was outside or inside. Of course, Derek wasn't completely reckless. Under the tutelage of the members of the Tarot Club, especially the Hanged Man, he clearly understood that there were times when one had to be patient, protect himself properly, and avoid unnecessary sacrifices in order to better defend the City of Silver. I'll only talk about the abnormality I observed. It shouldn't be dangerous. Derek consoled himself, running faster and faster. Finally, he saw the spire that represented the highest authority in the City of Silver. He found a Beyonder on duty and made a request to meet with the chief. To Derek's surprise, the Beyonder didn't ask the usual questions. After simply passing on the information, he was led up the stairs to the chief's room. Very strange. It's different from before. Derek felt that the changes in the details made him more uneasy. Entering the room, he saw Chief Colin Iliad standing in front of a wall. This tall elder, with his deep blue eyes and messy white hair, had his back facing 2 swords that hung on the wall. He wore his usual flaxen-colored shirt and brown coat, and it was hard to believe that he was an expert who had successfully hunted many devils and monsters. Derek Berg, what matter would actually require you to tell me it, face to face? Colin asked in a deep voice. Your Excellency. Derek saluted. I met the team that was sent to explore that temple at the training grounds today. I found that the Dark Regents I know has experienced a strange change. He's no longer as cheerful as he was before, and his smile is as polite as a stranger's. Also, Elder Lovia doesn't frequently change the way she speaks like she usually did. Colin looked deeply at Derek and asked in a low voice, just these two things? Yes, yes. Derek lowered his head. I think there might be something unusual about that. Colin waved his hand and said, I got it, I'll get Aflor to do an investigation. You may return. In the future, you just need to report such matters to the Guardian of the Spire directly. Aflor was the City of Silver's most experienced psyche analyst who was closest to Sequence 6. It was a pity that there was no potion formula after Sequence 7. After receiving such an answer, Derek left gloomily. Looking at Derek's back as he disappeared by the door, Colin sighed in disappointment. After talking to Dr. Aaron about Wuxia situation for a while, Klein got off the carriage and took the steam metro. After 3 stops, he arrived near Minsk Street and switched to a trackless public carriage to return home. As it was still early, he used divination to confirm that the previous tenant wasn't lying, and then he diligently continued to study the Book of Secrets. Ever since he had obtained this mysterious book, Klein's use of the mysterious space above the gray fog became more and more ingenious as he completed many more outstanding techniques. What limits me now is my own sequence, my own strength, and spirituality. Late at night, Klein hid the Book of Secrets and went to the bathroom to wash up, in preparation for bed. That night, he slept soundly. Even the church bells in the morning only made him turn over. Winter is the best time to stay in bed. Klein grunted and got up. To reward the hero Bandit Dark Emperor, he had a sugared hard-boiled egg and strawberry jam he specially bought to match with white bread. Just as he was enjoying his meal, the doorbell suddenly rang. Didn't I tell Mike to come after breakfast? He took a sip of the sweet soup and wiped his mouth with a napkin. According to his agreement with reporter Mike, he would only arrive half an hour after breakfast before they began interviewing the rescued girls of East Borough. If Mike didn't appear after half an hour, then it meant that the matter would be delayed by a day. Klein walked to the door, but before he could reach out his hand, the outline of a visitor appeared in his mind. He wasn't reporter Mike Joseph but Dr. Aaron Series. Good morning, Aaron. Did you sleep late last night? Klein noticed that Aaron's face was pale, so he quietly activated his spirit vision to take a look. Aaron took off his hat and cane and started to take off his coat, but the cold air in the room stopped him. Klein laughed dryly and said, As you know, I'll be going out today. Mike might come looking for me, so I didn't light up the fireplace. Aaron nodded and didn't say anything else. He followed Klein into the living room, found a seat and sat down. Sherlock, I had a nightmare last night. I dreamed about that child, Wuxia. Nightmare? This is within the limits of my knowledge. I'm a professional when it comes to interpreting dreams, far more professional than deduction. Klein leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said, What kind of nightmare? Aaron recalled and said, There are some details and processes that I can't remember. What I remember most is a tall, pitch-black steeple with a huge silver snake coiled around it. It was moving slowly, looking at me with its cold, merciless red eyes. I don't know why, but I entered the steeple, and I would go up the stairs and, at other times, down the stairs, going through walls after walls, and one locked door after another. Finally, I found the child called Wuxia in a dark corner. He hopped a few steps on one leg and curled up against the wall, with tarot cards scattered everywhere beside him. When he saw me, he was scared and happy. He called out, Darth Aaron. The whole dream was roughly like that before I woke up. Klein listened attentively and thought for a while before asking, Did Wuxia say anything else? Aaron frowned in thought before suddenly saying, Yes, he said, Dr. Aaron, a snake wants to eat me." Following that, a giant silver snake hung down from the ceiling, its head facing me. Its mouth was very big, but it has no teeth, no tongue, and it was completely blood red. Silver giant snake. A pitch-black steeple. Wuxia protected under layers of protection. Klein said to Dr. Aaron in a measured voice, "It's not a very strange dream. It likely has you subconsciously sensing some kind of predicament he was in while you were talking to Wuxia, that he was being threatened by something. That's why you dreamed of something like this, a child hiding in the depths of a tall steeple, behind countless walls and doors, huge silver snakes coiling around the top of the steeple." As a detective, we know a little bit of psychology. It's also often talked about in the newspapers. What I don't understand is why you didn't have such a dream until today. Klein didn't lie about his interpretation, but he didn't reveal the possible true reasons behind it. Aaron opened his mouth and said, "I was in too much of a hurry just now and forgot to mention something." As he spoke, he took out a leather wallet and took out a fairly exquisitely folded paper crane. After realizing that Wuxia and his family had moved away, I remembered that he had given me this before he left the hospital, saying, "Doctor, this will bring you good luck." I didn't pay much attention to it at the time and casually threw it into the office drawer. After parting with you last night, I went to retrieve it and put it in my wallet. As a result, I had a nightmare that very night. Klein looked at the paper crane, nodded thoughtfully and said, "Dr. Aaron, it looks like Wuxia didn't deliberately bring you bad luck. He had made up for it later. The paper crane invented by Emperor Roselle is meant to act as symbolism for wishing you well. Besides, he said it would bring you good luck." Aaron subconsciously asked, "Origami was invented by Emperor Roselle?" "I don't know if it's him, but I think it's likely him." Klein smiled. "Probably." Chapter 387, The Uniqueness of a Spirit World. Aaron was relieved by Klein's explanation and reassurance, and he prepared to observe for a few more days to see if there were any more nightmares such as this. After sending the famous surgeon out of the door with a smile, Klein's expression suddenly became solemn, as if he was thinking about something. There was no problem with his interpretation of the dream. The pitch-black steeple, the walls and doors that blocked his path, and the giant silver snake, they all symbolized that Wuxia was in a situation where he was threatened by something that symbolized the child's fear and helplessness, as well as his attempts to hide behind layers of protection. But the problem was that this was unlikely to be a revelation Dr. Aaron's spirituality had received on its own. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had such a dream only until last night, or when he found the paper crane. A similar development should have taken place long before Wuxia was discharged, back when his spirituality unconsciously became aware of the particularly strange developments, allowing him to have similar experiences as he had now. Therefore, Klein suspected that the medium which instilled the dream into Dr. Aaron was the paper crane. Klein activated his spirit vision to carefully observe this handicraft, but he didn't find any spiritual brilliance. However, his spiritual perception and intuition told him that there was something strange about this piece of origami. Certain magical aspects that might involve the most illusory, most difficult to comprehend, and most worthy of fear and reverence, fate. That child called Wuxia isn't simple. It seems like the most amazing thing wasn't the tarot card, but rather he himself. The giant silver snake is a symbol of danger, and this matter is related to bad luck, good luck, and other elements. Could it be that it represents the snake of Mercury, sequence 1 of the monster pathway? Klein's thoughts wandered, but he couldn't be certain of anything. He turned to question the problem of how the dream was instilled. With Klein's accomplishments in mysticism, this wasn't something that was too complicated or difficult to understand. He quickly came up with an idea. The first thing to do was to rule out the influence of specters and wraiths, which would have stained Dr. Aaron's aura with a blackish-green color of varying degrees, and I didn't see any sign of that just now. There are two main ways of instilling information without causing the owner of the dream to appear abnormal. One of them is using the beyonder powers of a nightmare like Captain. An objective is met through guidance, and it wouldn't involve the culprit, otherwise, traces would similarly be left behind. The second method would be even more ingenious and advanced. The principle of a dreamland is that of astral projections traveling through the spirit world, and the details that one would normally unwittingly notice, under external stimulation, would turn into a symbolic revelation. Or, they can obtain some enlightenment directly related to themselves from external sources. Then, their spirit bodies and psyche would be informed of this, and because the owner of the body was in a state of sleep, this will appear in the form of a dream. So the second way is to instill it into the spirit world. First, use some magical method to create the revelation that one will need, and then naturally let the target's astral projection obtain and feedback the information while roaming the spirit world. That way, the target will be able to dream of the scene that others would want them to dream of, and there will be no superficial traces. This is something that I'm currently unable to do, even if it's a spirit body that's able to partially wield some of the power above the gray fog. Klein paused for a moment and then added another possibility. A seed was planted in Dr. Aaron's subconscious through the paper crane, and once he found it, he would have the corresponding dream. That's easy to confirm. As long as I use mediumship on Dr. Aaron, should be able to find traces of it. However, would it be unfriendly to use mediumship on him? Or should I borrow the mental terror candle from Father Yatravsky? No, the one who recognized me was that vampire, the zealous figurine lover, Emlyn White, not the muscular, giant-like Father Yatravsky. Klein reined in his thoughts and considered his subsequent actions. He decided that he would wait until he went above the gray fog to divine the level of danger. If it was an acceptable level, he would sneak into Dr. Aaron's house tonight, use the dream charm and other methods to secretly observe him, and see if the source of the dreamland was a result of direct guidance or an indirect fabrication. However, with Klein's strength and level, it would be difficult to find traces of the latter. Even he himself didn't have much confidence. This didn't mean that his astral projection could travel the same spirit world as Dr. Aaron's astral projection by sitting next to him and entering cogitation. This required a sufficient amount of locking on to do so. According to the descriptions in the Book of Secrets, the existence of the spirit world was quite magical. It completely overlapped with the real world, so everyone could obtain revelations from the spirit world at any time. However, the spirit world didn't distinguish between directions, and the past, present, or future could even intersect there. It was like infinite knowledge, information, and illusions were spiritually gathered and compressed into a strange sea. It was different from the world as one would imagine according to usual concepts or logic. As a result of this, the revelations that one received from the spirit world could only be a variety of symbols, not direct answers. And precisely because of this, every astral projection's experience of traveling in the spirit world was not only related to their physical location and time, but it was also dependent on the current state of their body and the mind. Without locking on to the corresponding location, it made it impossible to lock onto and find a person's astral projection in the spirit world, even if one was physically next to them. This was also the reason why the astral projection's movement in the spirit world was limited and one doesn't dare to venture too deep. Once it got lost and was unable to return to its body, its owner would become a retard and, even more seriously, a vegetable. It was even more difficult to use the spirit world as a springboard for transference. If one wasn't careful, then they would lose their way and never be able to return to the real world until they rot to death. Phew. Klein exhaled, temporarily throwing the question to the back of his mind. He took out his pocket watch and looked at the time. He realized that he had been thinking too long, that his breakfast had already turned completely cold, and that the fact that reporter Mike hadn't arrived yet meant that the commission was likely to be delayed by a day. In the spirit of not wasting anything, Klein finished the rest of his meal and then went above the gray fog to make a divination. He was surprised to find that there were no revelations indicating danger at all. After doing all of this, the appointed time had passed. Without any hesitation, he changed into a heavy jacket, put on his cap, grabbed the vocabulary book, and left 15 Minsk Street. His initial plan was to accompany Mike Joseph to East Borough for an interview and find an opportunity to hint at Old Kohler to not mention his promise of helping Liv find her daughter. As for Liv's family, he let Old Kohler do the reminding. And now, after Mike had pushed back the interview by a day, Klein was even more at ease, no longer worried about any mishaps or mistakes. With the address mentioned by Old Kohler, and according to the revelation from divination, Klein entered the depths of East Borough, and under the watchful, wary, numb, or greedy gaze of the crowds, he found the room on the 3rd floor. There were 2 bunk beds here, and there were also some old and worn bedding on the floor. Every empty space was filled with sundries. Klein looked directly at the bottom bunk of the innermost bunk and called out, "Old Kohler." With a swoosh, Old Kohler sat up and leaned towards the door in pleasant surprise. "You really came. After sending you that letter yesterday, I already guessed that you would come looking for me today, so I didn't go to the dock. I've been waiting at home all this time. Well, I don't have to think about how to fabricate the lie about why I came straight here to find you." Klein looked around and said, "Old Kohler, with your current income, you can definitely rent a better room and move to a better place. Why did you only change your bed from the floor to a bunk bed? Most of the money is for gathering information for you." Old Kohler laughed. "And I'm no longer young. I need to save some money for the future when my future health wanes." Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "You can consider buying some insurance, such as a single elder aid policy. They can give you the money that can at least fill your stomach and a room for you to sleep in every week when you're really old." The insurance industry of this world had sprouted in the 4th epoch. After being promoted by Emperor Roselle, it had matured quite a bit. There were various kinds of insurance such as the various insurances for maritime trade, fire insurance, injury insurance, long-term care insurance in different names, and so on. They were mostly targeted at the rich and the middle class. I know. When I was a worker, I paid a premium of 3 pence a week, but after I lost my income, Old Kohler sighed. His biggest problem now was that his income was unstable, and he wondered when the money he received from the detective would be cut off. Klein couldn't promise anything either. He pointed outside and said, "Let's go to Liv's house and return the vocabulary book to the girl." After leaving the room, Klein casually mentioned, "What a joke. I was talking about doing volunteer work the day before yesterday and volunteered to help find Daisy, but she ended up being sent back by the police yesterday. Please don't mention it again, I don't want to be laughed at." "All right." Old Kohler agreed first, then he said, "No one will laugh at your kindness." After walking through the dirty streets, they arrived at Liv's house. Klein saw that the girl who had just been rescued had started ironing again, and he saw that the clothes here were hanging down and dripping with water. It was just as it was before. He was momentarily at a loss as to what to say. "Daisy." After a while, he said, "Your vocabulary book." Daisy's eyes lit up, but she was too busy to leave. After busying herself for quite a while, she stopped working and went to the door, thanking him profusely. After Liv and Freja had also put down their work and come over to express their gratitude, Klein repeated what he had just said to Old Kohler. After receiving positive responses, he took out the £2 worth of change that he had prepared and handed it to Liv. "There will be a reporter coming to interview Daisy tomorrow. This is the advance of the payment he's giving, but don't mention it in front of him, otherwise, things will become complicated. Heh, maybe he will give more tomorrow, but not that much. No, I'm willing to expose that bad guy's evil deeds. I don't want money." Daisy shook her head. Klein let out a soft chuckle. "This is a rule. You can't break rules, understand?" He looked at Liv and said, "Take it. Your belief is right. It's only if Daisy and Freja learn more words and learn more things will you all escape from this situation. He was going to suggest that Liv's family should move to the edge of East Borough. Customers who could afford to hire others to do their laundry wouldn't live in East Borough, but in the end, he didn't mention it. He had intended to provide them with more help, but he restrained himself. There were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people like Liv and her family in East Borough. Even if one was a wealthy banker who wanted to help them, they wouldn't be able to make a splash. Besides, this was just East Borough. There was still the entire Backland and the Lone Kingdom. Thank you, and help me thank the reporter for me. Liv was silent for a moment, then she took the money. Klein didn't stay for long. He quickly left as if there was a ghost that would devour his soul. After walking outside with old Kohler, he turned around and suddenly sighed. He said in a low voice, "There has never been a savior." Chapter 388, Exploring the Dreamland, What? Old Kohler asked, not hearing him clearly. Klein looked at the potholed road in front of him and said in a self-deprecating manner, "Nothing. I hope Liv's family can get out of this situation and live in better conditions." He had indeed voiced out his thoughts. Being one of the inheritors of the Foodaholic Empire's new era, it was perfectly normal for him to think of a revolution, to mobilize the masses, and to change the world. However, when he thought about the details, he felt that he couldn't save himself just by relying on the poor. This was because Beyonder forces existed in this world. Furthermore, they were relatively supernatural and couldn't be resolved simply by firearms. For instance, Sequence 5 of the Mutant Pathway. That was just one aspect of things. Another aspect of things was due to the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation. Due to the limited access to ingredients, Beyonder forces couldn't become commonplace, making it difficult to convert the advantage of numbers into effective combat power. And even if it could be spread, as long as the problem of losing control wasn't resolved, then it would still bring about disaster. If there weren't any high-sequence Beyonders, then there would actually be ways to deal with all of this to a certain extent. However, in the real world, not only were there demigods, but there were also sealed artifacts that could kill people without them even knowing how they died. Besides, deities were real and they stood high and lofty. In this way, the poor would use strikes and street protests to fight back. However, once they took up weapons and established an army, they would be met with an unstoppable counterattack. It wasn't impossible for a large-scale natural disaster to occur, one that would affect people psychologically. The only ones that were on par with the official Beyonder organizations were mostly secret organizations. Typically, they were related to evil forces, so by joining hands with them, death might not even be the most tragic ending. Therefore, to embark on the path of revolution, the most hopeful road to success was to get the support of one or more churches. How many concessions could be obtained through simple strikes and street protests while still meeting the vested interests of those involved? Bribery would be much easier. However, the incident regarding the true creator, who almost made use of the miserable situations of the poor to descend upon Backland, has seemed to stir the Church of the Evernight Goddess and the nobles who were aware of the situation. I can see that from the investigation mission that Mike had accepted and the information provided by Miss Justice. Klein's thoughts lingered on East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district. In the end, he couldn't help but let out a laugh and sigh in his heart. After all the ideas that come to me, it seems that only through the threat of an evil god's descent can the poor's situation be improved. However, the evil gods are also the ones who can't wait to draw on their flesh and blood, existences that devour their souls. They're the ones most likely to bring a disaster that no one can escape from. What wonderful irony! In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. As Dr. Escalante had upcoming matters she had to attend to, Audrey had brought forward her second psychology lesson for the week. Susie, more excited than she was, had long rushed into the study, even leaving the ball game she usually loved the most aside. Audrey purposely displayed her curiosity during this lesson, occasionally asking Escalante about psychology related to mysticism. At the end of the lesson, Escalante finally spoke after some deliberation. "Miss Audrey, we've organized a seminar on this subject. Many members have specialized in the intersecting field of psychology and mysticism. Are you interested in joining?" "Of course." Audrey nodded and answered without the slightest sign of hesitation. It perfectly matched her predetermined innocent and curious personality that she had set for herself. Escalante smiled. "Remember to keep this a secret. You know that your elders have a strong prejudice against the study of mysticism. I'll bring you there for the next lesson." "No problem." Audrey gave her consent with a hint of excitement. After sending off Escalante, whose hair reached her waist, out the study, she closed the door behind her, faced the mirror by the bookcase, and remained silent for 2 seconds. Following that, she lifted up her skirt and took a step and did a swirl from a court dance. Then, looking at herself in the mirror, she sweetly smiled and said, "Audrey, you're great." Audrey knew that she had taken the first step in entering the psychology alchemists. Although the seminar was most likely an outer circle, and there would definitely be a lot of tests to follow, this really made her open the door to the psychology alchemists. In the process, she didn't borrow strength from the outside world, but instead, she relied solely on her observation and performance to perfectly hide it from psychiatrist Dr. Escalante. Therefore, she was very proud of herself. "That seminar sounds interesting." Susie leaned over and wagged her tail. "Audrey, can I join?" "Join?" Looking at this golden retriever with its wicked round eyes, Audrey immediately sank into deep thought. She dragged out a terse acknowledgement. "I can't do it at the moment, Susie." "Why, you're too conspicuous." At this point, she changed the topic of their conversation and said with a slight smile, "But I can bring you along." On Saturday night, taking his master key in his black cane, Klein walked out of 15 Minsk Street. Without the latter, he didn't think that he would be able to return today. He was going to find Dr. Aaron, enter his dream, and find out how the nightmare regarding Wuxia came about. As for where Dr. Aaron lived, he had already found out yesterday, 3 Birmingham Road, Hillston Borough. By the time Klein arrived, it was past 11 o'clock and the neighborhood was dark and silent. After tossing a coin and performing a divination, Klein passed through the outer bars, walked around to the side, and used the master key to open up an invisible passage through the wall into the dark corridor. With his agile steps, he quietly went up to the second floor and hid in an empty guest room. When it was clear that Dr. Aaron and his wife were asleep, Klein entered their bedroom through the wall. The first thing he did was take out a slumber charm and mutter the incantation, making Dr. Aaron's wife really fall asleep, preventing her from suddenly waking up and disturb what he would subsequently do to her husband. Then, Klein sat down on a chair in front of the dresser, held the dream charm in his hand, and whispered a word in ancient Hermes, "Crimson." As soon as he finished saying that, he felt the charm in his palm become light, as though it had become a weightless illusion. As his spirituality poured in, a transparent flame wrapped around the charm, burning a deep and serene black. Driven by Klein's will, the blackness spread out, enveloping both Dr. Aaron and himself. Klein quickly entered a cogitation state and saw the endless darkness and the single oval-shaped light. His spirituality extended out and touched that illusory and hazy object. The world around him suddenly turned upside down and twisted, and Klein found himself on a barren plain, with pitch-black stones at his feet and not even a blade of grass. In the center of the plain stood a black steeple with a huge silver snake coiled around it. It had its head reared up, and its red eyes stared coldly in their direction. Unlike what Dr. Aaron had described, the silver serpent had no physical scales, and its body was covered in dense patterns and symbols. They were all connected to each other into what seemed like wheels, and there were different symbols around each wheel. The giant snake's tail and head's wheels were each halved, looking incongruous, as though they could kill a person with obsessive-compulsive disorder, but Klein imagined that if the giant silver snake could bite its own tail with its mouth, the wheel would be complete. It wouldn't be disconnected, and there wouldn't be any more changes. Next to Klein, Dr. Aaron stared blankly ahead, moving closer and closer to the dark steeple. I can now confirm that no one is guiding Dr. Aaron. That excludes Nightmare Beyonder powers. Klein quickly made a judgment. He didn't stop Dr. Aaron, but he followed him towards the black steeple and the silver snake. The two of them had only taken a few steps when their target had already appeared before them. The giant silver snake had its upper body bent down, as though it was considering how to enjoy the dessert that was delivered to its mouth. Its mouth opened wide, but there was no putrid smell coming from it. Its red eyes were cold and merciless, looking at everything like they were nothing more than prey, yet, it didn't have the slightest hint of bloodlust or cruelty. In front of it, everything seemed puny and equal because of their insignificance. In the end, the serpent didn't launch an attack. Klein followed Dr. Aaron through an old, rotting wooden door and into the darkness of the tower. As Aaron had told him, the layout was abnormally confusing and chaotic. The stairs spiraled up and down, and the halls, libraries, and rooms were normal, inverted, and some were embedded in other parts. It was a building that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. After passing through the doors and walls, Klein had no idea where he was in the Black Tower. Perhaps he had reached the top or perhaps the basement. In the rich darkness, he suddenly noticed a figure curled up in the corner in front of him. The figure, sensing Dr. Aaron's approach, scrambled to its feet, hopping over on one leg. It was only when the figure was very close did Klein clearly see him. He looked dignified and strong, in his early teens, and had an expression of obvious fear. The figure was about 1.4 meters tall, and his left calf was missing. It was obvious that he was the child who had undergone surgery, Wuxia. In his hand was a deck of tarot cards. His pitch-black eyes were filled with surprise and joy, as well as fear and horror. "Dr. Aaron, a snake wants to eat me." Suddenly, he let out a blood-curdling scream as the image of a huge, mysterious silver snake was reflected in his eyes. Whoosh! The tarot cards in his hand fell to the ground, leaving only one card tightly gripped in his palm. Klein focused his gaze over it and saw that there was, similarly, a wheel on the card. It was the Wheel of Fortune card. Whoosh! The dream shattered instantly, and Klein found himself still sitting in a chair in front of the dresser. Chapter 389, Nighthawk. The crimson moon outside the window was obscured by the clouds, its moonlight that penetrated through the curtain barely outlined the large objects in the bedroom. The darkness and intensity became the main theme of the room. Klein sat in such an environment and was in no hurry to leave. He looked at the sleeping Dr. Aaron and began to analyze the images he had seen in the dream. Wuxia eventually held the Wheel of Fortune card in his hand. And in such a dream, everything symbolizes something. It's a revelation obtained by one's astral projection. In other words, Wuxia's matter is related to fate. Furthermore, that giant silver snake might very well represent the snake of Mercury. This child might actually be related to a high-sequence Beyonder, be of the monster pathway or some strange sealed artifact. Does his danger stem from the snake of Mercury or the result of greed due to the strange sealed artifact? But the snake of Mercury is sequence 1. It's an existence closest to that of a god. Just its name on its own is an embodiment of his high level. It's impossible that he can't do anything to a child like Wuxia. That a mon who is of an unknown sequence number, perhaps sequence 1, 2, or 3, could even invade the space above the gray fog with just an avatar. This matter doesn't seem to be that simple. There must be a huge secret behind his matter. At this thought, Klein had already decided to pull back completely. It's obviously a very dangerous matter. Furthermore, that tarot card might not be a mystical item. What special might very well be Wuxia himself. Yes, apart from having nightmares, Dr. Aaron's troubles are already settled. There's no reason for me to get involved in it. To proactively act on this and challenge the impossible is nearly identical to suicide. Yes, I must follow what my heart tells me. Klein pushed the surface of the dressing table with his black-gloved right hand and slowly stood up. Having just entered the dream, he was completely convinced that Dr. Aaron's nightmare came from a revelation that his astral projection had received in the spirit world. And that revelation had been deliberately created and provided by a high-level existence. The paper crane was just a tool for locating him. According to a chapter in the Book of Secrets, Klein could also try to use the paper crane to find Dr. Aaron's astral projection in the spirit world and observe the source of the revelation, but he had already decided to not get involved. Stretching his body, Klein flipped through Dr. Aaron's leather wallet with the last of his curiosity, and he took out the paper crane. He placed the paper crane on the tip of his cane, and he held them simultaneously. Then, his eyes turned deep as he softly muttered to himself, Wuxia's current location. After the divination sentence was repeated 7 times, a breeze suddenly blew in the room, bringing with it a cool feeling as if it were blowing on one's soul. Klein let go of his right palm, and the cane stood firm before falling down with the paper cranes, pointing diagonally at the bed. There, Klein frowned and moved to another position. He repeated the divination and successfully received his feedback. And the intersection point of the 2 divinations was Dr. Aaron. Wuxia's position overlaps with that of Dr. Aaron. That's interesting. Klein said to himself, amused and amazed. His curiosity was piqued to the extreme. Although he didn't intend to get involved in this matter, he wanted to know why there was an overlapping situation such as this. Why don't I bring the paper crane above the gray fog for divination? With the gray fog's obstruction, there won't be any accidents. Klein quickly came up with a new idea. Since it wasn't convenient for him to summon himself in Dr. Aaron's bedroom, he decided to take the paper crane home first. He had actually long prepared for this. Before coming, Klein couldn't confirm the seriousness of the matter, and he had hoped to find Wuxia, seeing if he had the opportunity to obtain the tarot card. Therefore, he had prepared another paper crane to replace the real one. It made it easier for him to do all sorts of divination, and he could switch it back once the problem was resolved. As soon as he thought of it, Klein took out the paper crane he had prepared. He had deliberately folded it above the gray fog, just in case Dr. Aaron had suddenly decided to hand over anything related to Wuxia to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, allowing his counterfeit to be divined. Taking into account the overall picture and the details would make things much easier. Klein praised himself. With the help of the faint moonlight, he carefully compared Wuxia's paper crane and his, to see if there were any clear differences. Upon comparing them, Klein immediately fell silent. His handicraft skills weren't even comparable to a child's. In fact, they're all paper cranes, so there isn't much of a difference. Mine is only a little cruder. As long as Aaron hadn't studied the original one carefully, then he wouldn't be able to tell that it has been swapped. Klein muttered silently to himself, took out a coin, and used divination to make a final confirmation. After receiving a revelation that confirmed this, he put his paper crane back into Aaron's wallet and returned it to its original position. He then took care of the scene, bringing Wuxia's paper crane along with him and left 3 Birmingham Road. With the help of the dowsing rod, Klein successfully returned home. While he was taking a bath, he summoned himself and brought the paper crane along with the master key above the gray fog. Sitting in the quiet and empty palace hall, he picked up the paper crane and carefully examined it for a few seconds, but he didn't discover anything abnormal. Then, with a pen and paper, Klein wrote the same divination sentence as before, Wuxia's current location. This time, he switched to using dream divination, and he was pleasantly surprised to see an image appear in the world of the gray fog. It was a dark room. A strong and dignified Wuxia leaned against the desk with the help of a chair by the window, and he looked out at the scenery with his pitch-black eyes. He held a stack of tarot cards in each hand, and beside them, there was a pile of wooden blocks. The wooden blocks formed a ring-shaped snake that connected itself from head to tail. The scene outside the window was just as dark, and there was the faint sound of flowing water. The dream ended here without a sound. Klein opened his eyes, tapped the edge of the long bronze table with his finger, and he said to himself, that Ouroboros-like snake is indeed the snake of Mercury? That means it's the snake of Mercury which represents fate. There was the sound of running water outside the window. Does that mean that Wuxia's current position is close to the Tussock River? Previously, when I divined his position, was the overlap with Dr. Aaron caused due to interference by fate? Seeing that divination above the grey fog could only receive a revelation of this degree, Klein was no longer troubled by curiosity. He barely interpreted the situation and planned to exchange the paper crane tomorrow night. He would then find an opportunity to guide Dr. Aaron and have him go to the church of the Evernight Goddess to tell the bishop about this matter. It's best to leave such matters to the officials. Klein let out a chuckle and returned to the real world. After taking a leisurely bath, he didn't get busy and crawled into bed. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly realized that he was clearly dreaming. He was in the living room, reading the Book of Secrets. This familiar feeling. He turned his head to look at the door like he usually did. The door creaked open, and a figure in a grey coat walked in. He was about 30 years old, with a long, thin face with a broad forehead, and dark blue eyes that looked intelligent. It's not the captain. Klein suddenly gave a self-deprecating laugh, let out a silent breath, and turned the Book of Secrets in his hand into a copy of Ladies' Aesthetic. He flipped through the magazine, casually greeting the newcomer. The man in the grey coat took off his hat and sat down across him, seemingly casually asking him, "Aaron came to see you this morning?" "It really is a Nighthawk, a nightmare." Klein resisted the urge to sigh and replied with a smile, "Yes." He had already figured out why the Nighthawk had suddenly entered his dream. The nightmare in front of him was likely the captain of the Nighthawk's team responsible for the matter regarding Wuxia, but they had yet to find any useful clues up to date. In this case, Dr. Aaron and Detective Sherlock Moriarty's act of visiting to ask about Wuxia's whereabouts must have been made known to them last night or this morning. At the same time, they discovered that Dr. Aaron rushed over to Minsk Street, shortly after he finished his breakfast, to visit Detective Sherlock Moriarty. In the spirit of professionalism, entering a person's dream at night was the most natural and normal development. As for Dr. Aaron, his situation was rather sensitive, so rashly entering a dream might cut off clues, so there was no doubt that a certain detective became the first choice. "What did he encounter?" the captain of the Nighthawk's team asked, casually. Klein answered honestly, he had a nightmare. Klein described the pitch-black tower, the giant silver snake, and Wuxia under layers of protection, and other scenes. Finally, he said, before this nightmare, Aaron had gone to Wuxia's place to find the child, partially because he was worried about his health but also because he was puzzled over his bad luck. Unfortunately, the Wuxia family had moved away. However, Aaron recalled that the boy had given him a paper crane that the boy had folded himself and had wished him luck. Perhaps agitated by these two events, he had such a nightmare. The man in the grey coat looked pleasantly surprised. "Paper crane?" "Yes." Klein nodded slightly. "The child gave it to Aaron before he was discharged, and Aaron threw it into his office drawer. He forgot about it until last night." "I understand. Thank you for your explanation." The captain of the Nighthawk's team stood up and bowed with his hand against his chest in a very polite manner. Suddenly, there was a ripple in the Dreamland, and he disappeared from the room. Looking at the position where he had sat, Klein deduced what would happen next. The Nighthawks might go to Dr. Aaron's tonight and enter his dream for investigations and take the paper crane away. However, a question arose. The paper crane was folded by Klein, and the real thing was above the gray fog. Forget it. Regardless of which paper crane they use, they'll never be able to divine the answer. It doesn't matter if I switch it back or not, Klein said to himself. He gathered his thoughts and continued to sit there. He wasn't in a hurry to leave the Dreamland, and he stared blankly for a long time. After a while, the corners of his mouth curled up as he softly sighed. How nostalgic. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.